Carl Jung explained, 11 signs you're vibrating at a frequency. Most people can't understand. There comes a moment in every soul's journey when the familiar world begins to shimmer at its edges, when the solid ground of ordinary consciousness reveals itself as something far more mysterious than we ever dared imagine. You have felt it, haven't you? That subtle shift in the fabric of your reality, like the first crack appearing in ice that has held firm through a long winter. It is not dramatic. This initial awakening rarely announces itself with fanfare or revelation. Instead, it whispers. It whispers in the space between your thoughts, in the pause before sleep, in those moments when you catch yourself staring into nothing and realize you have been somewhere else entirely. Jung understood this threshold intimately, for he himself stood at its precipice when his own carefully constructed world began to unravel in what he would later call his confrontation with the unconscious. But unraveling, as you are beginning to discover, is not destruction, it is revelation. You may have noticed that conversations feel different now, as if you are listening to them from a great distance, even when you are fully present. The topics that once engaged you completely, the endless discussions about weather, work, the surface dramas of daily existence, now feel like echoes in a vast cathedral. You hear them, you respond appropriately, but some part of you has withdrawn into a deeper listening. You are tuning into frequencies that were always there, but were previously drowned out by the noise of collective consensus reality. This is not depression, though others might mistake it for such. This is not detachment born of cynicism or despair. This is the soul beginning to recognize its own voice among the chorus of voices that have shaped your identity since birth. The persona, that carefully crafted mask Jung described as our social face, begins to feel less like an authentic expression and more like a costume that no longer fits quite right. You wear it still, but with increasing awareness that it is indeed a costume, not your true skin. The ego, that faithful guardian of your personal history and social identity, senses something stirring in the depths and grows uneasy. It has spent years, perhaps decades, building a coherent story about who you are, what you want, where you belong in the world. But now there are stirrings from below, intimations of vastness that threaten the ego's neat categories and comfortable explanations. Like a parent sensing their child is growing beyond their ability to protect and control, the ego alternates between clinging more tightly and stepping back in wonder. You may find yourself drawn to different books now, pulled toward authors and ideas that would have seemed incomprehensible or irrelevant before. The mystical traditions that once appeared as abstract philosophy now read like instruction manuals for a journey you didn't know you were taking. Poetry that seemed overly complex reveals layers of meaning that speak directly to something awakening. Within you, you are developing new eyes, new ears, new capacities for perception that extend beyond the 5 senses that once defined the boundaries of the real. Dreams begin to carry more weight, more presence in your waking consciousness. Where once they were fleeting curiosities, easily forgotten in the rush toward morning obligations, they now linger with the persistence of remembered conversations with old friends. You find yourself writing them down, paying attention to their recurring symbols and themes. Without necessarily understanding Jung's detailed theory of dream interpretation, you sense intuitively that these nocturnal narratives are not random neural static, but meaningful communications from some deeper aspect of yourself. The world itself begins to speak in a language you are just learning to decipher. Synchronicities, those meaningful coincidences Jung wrote about so extensively, start appearing with increasing frequency in your experience. A song plays at the exact moment you need to hear its message. A book falls open to a passage that addresses the very question troubling your heart. A stranger speaks words that echo thoughts you had but never voiced. These are not coincidences in the traditional sense. They are indicators that the membrane between your inner world and outer reality is becoming more porous, more permeable to the flow of meaning. You may notice that your relationship with time begins to shift. The linear progression from past through present to future, that fundamental organizing principle of ego consciousness, starts to feel less absolute. Moments expand and contract in ways that have nothing to do with the clock on the wall. Minutes can feel like hours when you are fully present to something beautiful or profound. Conversely, entire days can pass in what feels like the blink of an eye when you are deeply absorbed in inner work or creative expression. You are beginning to experience what the mystics have always known, that time, like so much of what we consider fixed reality, is far more fluid than ordinary consciousness recognizes. The threshold you are crossing is ancient and universal, yet entirely unique to your particular journey. Every culture has myths and traditions that describe this passage from ordinary consciousness into deeper awareness. The hero's journey, the dark night of the soul, the shamanic initiation, the alchemical nigredo, these are all attempts to map the territory you are entering. But maps, however accurate, are not the territory itself. Your journey will have its own landmarks, its own challenges, its own revelations. This awakening often brings with it a profound sense of loneliness, but it is not the loneliness of being abandoned or rejected. It is the loneliness of the pioneer, the explorer who has ventured into territory that few others have chosen to enter. You may look around at friends, family members, colleagues, and wonder how they can remain so seemingly unconscious of the depths you are discovering. Their concerns, their automatic responses, their unexamined assumptions about life and reality begin to feel foreign, as if you are slowly learning a new language while they continue to speak only in the old tongue. Yet, this sense of separation, painful as it may be, is a necessary part of the individuation process. Jung understood that becoming who you truly are requires a certain stepping away from the collective identifications that once defined you. This does not mean rejecting or judging others for their different level of awareness. Rather, it means honoring your own unique path while maintaining compassion for those who are walking different paths or who have not yet felt the call to deeper exploration. The frequency you are beginning to access is not superior to other frequencies. It is simply different, and it is yours. Like a radio being slowly tuned to pick up a distant station, your consciousness is adjusting its reception to perceive signals that were always broadcasting but were previously beyond your range. This adjustment takes time, patience, and often requires letting go of the static and interference of conventional thinking that can block clearer reception. You may find yourself spending more time in solitude, not from antisocial tendencies, but from a growing need for quiet in which to hear the subtle voices that speak only in stillness. Nature becomes a sanctuary, a place where the frequency you are learning to embody feels most natural and supported. The rhythms of earth and sky, the cycles of growth and decay, the patient unfolding of seasons, all of these begin to feel like extensions of processes happening within your own psyche. This threshold of recognition is simultaneously an ending and a beginning. It marks the end of unconscious participation in collective reality and the beginning of conscious engagement with your own individuation process. The person you were is not being destroyed, but rather expanded beyond its previous limitations. Like a chrysalis beginning to dissolve, the old structures of identity become fluid, making space for something unprecedented to emerge. The ancient alchemists spoke of the prima materia, the first matter from which transformation begins. This threshold experience is your encounter with your own prima materia, the raw psychological material that contains both your current limitations and your unrealized potential. It is chaotic and confusing, beautiful and terrifying, familiar and utterly strange. It requires courage to remain present with this material, rather than fleeing back to the safety of unexamined assumptions about yourself and life. As you stand at this threshold, remember that recognition is itself a form of transformation. 2. See clearly what was previously unconscious is to begin the process of integration that lies at the heart of Jung's understanding of psychological development. You are not becoming someone other than who you are. You are becoming more fully and consciously who you have always been, beneath the layers of conditioning, expectation, and unconscious identification. The journey that lies ahead will challenge everything you thought you knew about yourself and reality. It will ask you to embrace paradox, to hold opposites in creative tension, to find meaning in chaos and order in apparent meaninglessness, but it will also reveal to you depths of wisdom, creativity, and authentic power that you may have glimpsed, but never fully claimed. This is the gift of consciousness, the reward for those who are willing to venture beyond the comfortable boundaries of collective consensus reality into the vast territories of the psyche where true individuation awaits. There is an ancient card in the tarot deck that speaks to your current condition with startling accuracy. The hermit, standing alone on a mountain peak, lantern held high against the darkness, illuminating a path that only he can see. This is no image of loneliness or withdrawal from life, but rather the portrait of one who has discovered that the most profound truths are found not in the chatter of crowds, but in the sacred silence of solitary communion with the depths of being. You have felt it calling, haven't you? This inexorable pull away from the noise and distraction of collective existence towards something infinitely more nourishing and real. It began perhaps as a whisper, a subtle preference for your own company over the endless social obligations that once seemed so important. But gradually, imperceptibly, that whisper has grown into a song, a melody that plays only in solitude, a frequency that can only be heard when the external clamor finally falls away. This is the first sign that you are vibrating at a frequency most people cannot understand. Your natural, irresistible gravitation towards solitude, not as escape from life, but as the deepest possible engagement with it. Where others flee from being alone with themselves, you are discovering it as a homecoming. Where others fill every moment with distraction, stimulation, and social interaction, you are learning to treasure the pregnant silence that exists between thoughts, between breaths, between the heartbeats of ordinary consciousness. The collective world has taught us to fear solitude, to interpret it as failure, depression, or antisocial behavior. We are conditioned to believe that constant connection, endless communication, and perpetual stimulation are signs of a life well lived. But you are discovering what the mystics and depth psychologists have always known, that the most profound transformations happen in the crucible of solitude, where the soul can finally hear its own voice above the din of external expectations and social conditioning. Jung himself understood this necessity intimately. His most creative periods, his deepest insights, his encounters with the living symbols of the unconscious, all emerged from his willingness to descend into solitude and meet whatever he found there. The Red Book, that extraordinary record of his dialogue with the unconscious, was born in the silence of his study, in hours of patient listening to voices that spoke only when the outer world fell quiet. Your solitude is not the solitude of the exile or the hermit fleeing from human contact. It is the solitude of the mystic, the artist, the depth psychologist, those who have discovered that the most fascinating conversations happen not between people, but between the conscious ego and the vast unconscious depths of the psyche. You are learning to be alone with yourself in the most profound sense, not just physically isolated, but psychologically present to the extraordinary inner world that most people never take the time to explore. In this solitude, you have begun to notice things that remain invisible in the blur of social activity. Dreams take on weight and substance, becoming not mere fragments of sleep, but meaningful communications from aspects of yourself that have no other way to speak. The symbolic language of the unconscious begins to unfold like a flower blooming in slow motion, revealing layers of meaning that were always there but required silence to perceive. You may find yourself drawn to activities that once seemed pointless or self-indulgent, long walks without destination, hours spent gazing at natural beauty, periods of simply sitting in stillness with no agenda beyond being present to whatever arises. These are not signs of laziness or escapism. They are the practices of one who is learning to attune to frequencies that operate below the threshold of ordinary consciousness. The inner light that you carry, like the lantern of the hermit, burns brightest in the darkness of solitude. This light is not something you must create or manufacture. It is your essential nature, your connection to what Jung called the self, that archetypal center of wholeness that exists beyond the boundaries of personal identity. But this light requires the darkness of withdrawal from external stimulation to be seen clearly. Just as stars are invisible during the day but blazing in the night sky, the luminous depths of your being reveal themselves only when the harsh fluorescent glare of collective consciousness finally dims. Your relationship with noise has fundamentally changed. What once passed for stimulating conversation now often feels like static, interfering with clearer reception. The endless chatter about surface concerns, weather, politics, gossip, complaints, creates a kind of psychic white noise that makes it impossible to hear the subtle frequencies you are learning to receive. You find yourself naturally withdrawing from environments that assault your increasingly sensitive psychic antennae with their chaotic mixture of unprocessed emotions, unconscious reactions, and collective projections. This is not misanthropy or judgment of others. It is simply recognition that your consciousness is undergoing a fundamental recalibration. Like a radio being tuned to receive stations from distant galaxies, your psyche requires a certain quality of silence and space to pick up the signals that are now available to you. The old frequencies that once satisfied you, the comfortable exchanges of social pleasantries, the familiar rhythms of conventional thinking, no longer provide the nourishment your soul requires. In solitude, you discover that you are never truly alone. The psyche reveals itself as a vast ecosystem, teeming with autonomous complexes, archetypal figures, and creative energies that have been waiting patiently for your attention. Jung's technique of active imagination, that revolutionary method of conscious dialogue with unconscious contents, becomes not just a therapeutic tool, but a way of life. You learn to engage with the figures that emerge from your depths as real presences deserving of respect and consideration. The persona, that social mask you wear in collective settings, begins to feel increasingly foreign during these periods of solitude. Stripped of the need to maintain social acceptability, you encounter aspects of yourself that have been hidden beneath layers of conditioning and expectation. This can be initially disturbing as you meet parts of your personality that don't conform to the idealized self-image you've cultivated. But gradually, you begin to appreciate this raw authenticity as infinitely more interesting and alive than the polished persona you present to the world. Your solitude becomes a laboratory for self-discovery, a sacred space where you can experiment with different ways of being without the pressure of external judgment or approval. You learn to inhabit your own consciousness more fully, to explore its far reaches and hidden corners with the curiosity of an explorer mapping unknown territory. The inner landscape reveals itself as far more vast and varied than you ever imagined, containing not just personal memories and experiences, but archetypal patterns that connect you to the deepest layers of human experience. Time moves differently in solitude. Freed from the artificial schedules and social rhythms that normally structure your days, you begin to discover your natural circadian patterns, the organic rhythms of your particular psyche. You may find yourself most creative at unusual hours, most receptive to unconscious material during times when the collective is asleep or distracted. This natural timing becomes another frequency you learn to honor, another aspect of your unique psychological fingerprint. The silence you cultivate is not empty, but pregnant with possibility. It is the silence of the composer before the symphony. Emerges the painter before the first brushstroke, the mystic before revelation dawns. In this silence, you begin to hear what Jung called the transcendent function, that creative capacity of the psyche to generate new solutions, fresh perspectives, and novel syntheses from the apparent contradictions of conscious experience. Dreams become your nightly companions, arriving with the regularity of old friends who know they will be welcomed and heard. Your dream journal grows thick with images and narratives that weave together personal concerns with universal themes, creating a tapestry of meaning that becomes increasingly rich and complex over time. You begin to recognize recurring figures, animals, landscapes, mysterious strangers, as aspects of your own psyche, speaking in the ancient language of symbol and metaphor. Synchronicities multiply in the spaciousness of solitude, as if the psyche and the world conspire more easily when there is room for magic to unfold. Books fall open to exactly the passages you need to read. Animals appear at moments when their symbolic significance provides perfect commentary on your inner state. Numbers, images, and phrases repeat themselves across different contexts until their significance becomes impossible to ignore. You are learning to read the world as a vast text whose meaning becomes clear only to those who have developed the capacity for contemplative attention. The pull towards solitude intensifies as you discover how much more interesting your own company becomes. When you are truly present to it, conversations with yourself, whether through journaling, meditation, or simple reflective thinking, prove more stimulating and revelatory than most social interactions. You are discovering what Jung meant when he spoke of the relationship between ego and self as the most important relationship of a lifetime, the ongoing dialogue between your conscious personality and the deeper wisdom of your essential nature. This solitary path requires courage, for it means releasing attachment to external validation and social approval as measures of your worth. You are learning to find your center not in the opinions of others, but in your own deep knowing, not in collective consensus, but in personal truth. This is profoundly threatening to the ego, which has been trained to seek security through conformity and belonging. But something stronger than ego is now guiding your steps, the self, that archetype of wholeness that draws you inexorably toward authentic individuation. The hermit's lantern that you carry illuminates not just your own path, but becomes a beacon for others who are ready to undertake their own journey into the depths. Though you walk alone, you are paradoxically preparing yourself to serve as a guide for others who will eventually feel the same call to solitude, the same need to discover what treasures lie hidden in the silence between thoughts, the same irresistible pull toward the numinous depths where the soul finally comes home to itself. There comes a moment in the journey of consciousness when the comfortable illusions that have cushioned your passage through life begin to dissolve like morning mist before the harsh light of truth. This is the second sign that you are operating on a frequency most others cannot bear to receive. your growing capacity to hold uncomfortable truths about human nature, not just in others, but most courageously in yourself. Where once you might have turned away from the darker revelations of the human condition, you now find yourself drawn to them with the fascination of an archaeologist uncovering buried treasures in the ruins of denial. This capacity did not arrive overnight. It has been cultivated through what Jung called shadow work, that painstaking, often painful process of retrieving and integrating the rejected aspects of your personality that have been banished to the unconscious depths. Like a master craftsman learning to work with the most difficult materials, you have gradually developed the psychological strength and flexibility needed to handle truths that would shatter a more fragile or defended consciousness. The shadow, as Jung understood it, is not simply the repository of evil or negative traits. It is the container of everything about yourself that you have deemed unacceptable, inappropriate, or incompatible with your idealized self-image. It holds your repressed anger, your secret longings, your primitive impulses, your capacity for cruelty, your hidden selfishness, your abandoned dreams, your disowned creativity. But it also contains tremendous vitality, authenticity, and power, energy that remains unavailable to consciousness as long as it remains in exile. Your journey into shadow work began perhaps with small recognitions. You noticed yourself having thoughts that contradicted your carefully maintained moral positions. You caught glimpses of motivations that were less pure than you preferred to believe. You observed reactions in yourself that revealed depths of jealousy, rage, or desire that felt foreign to your conscious identity. Where once you might have quickly suppressed these observations or rationalized them away, you began instead to look at them with curiosity. This shift from rejection to curiosity marks a fundamental transformation in your relationship with the totality of your being. Jung discovered through his own courageous self-examination that the shadow cannot be eliminated or transcended. It can only be acknowledged, understood, and gradually integrated into a more complete and honest sense of self. This integration is not about acting out every shadow impulse, but about owning the full spectrum of your humanity with consciousness and choice rather than unconscious compulsion. As your shadow work deepened, you began to develop what might be called psychological peripheral vision, the ability to perceive not just what people present consciously, but what they are unconsciously expressing through their body language, their choice of words, their defensive reactions, their projections onto others. The persona, that carefully crafted social mask, became increasingly transparent to your expanding awareness. You could see through the polished presentations to the insecurities, fears, and unresolved conflicts that drove them. This developing capacity for psychological X-ray vision can be profoundly isolating. Conversations that once seemed straightforward reveal themselves as elaborate dances of projection and counter-projection. Social interactions become layered with unspoken tensions, hidden agendas, and unconscious power dynamics that few participants recognize. You find yourself seeing not just what people say they want, but what they actually need. Not just their conscious intentions, but their unconscious patterns of self-sabotage and defensive maneuvering. The uncomfortable truth you've learned to hold is that human beings are far more complex, contradictory, and unconscious than they generally realize or admit. The rational, moral, well-intentioned self that most people identify with is often a thin veneer covering vast territories of unexamined motivation, repressed emotion, and shadow material that continues to influence behavior from behind the scenes. This recognition does not lead you to cynicism or judgment, but to a kind of compassionate realism about the human condition. You have discovered what Jung meant when he wrote that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. This acceptance does not mean resignation or permission to act destructively. Rather, it means developing the capacity to hold your complete psychological reality, light and shadow, noble and petty, conscious and unconscious, in awareness without being overwhelmed by guilt, shame, or the need to fragment yourself into acceptable and unacceptable parts. This integration creates a paradoxical effect. The more honestly you acknowledge your capacity for darkness, the more access you have to authentic light. The more you own your potential for selfishness, the more genuine your generosity becomes. The more you accept your human limitations, the more you can access transpersonal wisdom. Jung called this the enantiodromia, the tendency of psychological attitudes to transform into their opposites when they reach their extreme. Only by fully claiming your shadow can you step into authentic wholeness. Others often find your increasing honesty about human nature disturbing or threatening. In a culture that maintains its equilibrium through collective agreement, to ignore certain truths about motivation, behavior, and the darker aspects of social dynamics, your willingness to see and speak clearly can feel dangerous. You may find yourself becoming the repository for others' projections, blamed for being negative, judgmental, or pessimistic when you are simply seeing more clearly than they are comfortable with. This response from others is understandable but painful. The persona depends on collective agreement to maintain its illusions. When someone begins to see through the agreed-upon pretenses, it threatens everyone's carefully maintained self-image. Your growing authenticity becomes a mirror that reflects back the gaps between what others claim to be and what they actually embody. This is rarely welcomed, even when it is offered with compassion and discretion. You learn to navigate this dynamic with increasing wisdom, developing sensitivity about when and with whom to share your deeper perceptions. Not everyone is ready for the level of psychological honesty you have learned to tolerate. This discrimination is not about superiority or judgment, but about recognition that consciousness develops at different rates and through different experiences. What feels like liberation to you might feel like assault to someone whose psychological defenses are still necessary for their survival. The mirror you have become reflects not just individual shadow material, but collective shadows as well. You begin to recognize the unconscious dynamics that drive social and political movements, the shadow projections that fuel conflicts between groups, the collective denial that allows systemic problems to persist. This broader vision can be overwhelming as you witness humanity's tendency to repeat the same unconscious patterns on ever larger scales. Yet your capacity to hold these uncomfortable truths serves a crucial function in the collective psyche. Like the ancient oracles who spoke difficult truths to power, you serve as a vessel for awareness that would otherwise remain unconscious. Your willingness to see clearly, even when seeing is painful, contributes to the slow, often imperceptible, process of collective awakening. Every individual who becomes conscious of their shadow reduces the amount of unconscious darkness operating in the world. The fruit of this shadow work is not cynicism, but genuine compassion. When you have faced your own capacity for cruelty, selfishness, and destruction, you can meet these qualities in others with understanding rather than righteous judgment. When you have wrestled with your own demons and learned to integrate them consciously, you can offer others the space to do the same work without trying to fix, save, or condemn them for their human imperfections. This compassion extends most importantly to yourself. The harsh inner critic that once policed your thoughts and feelings with relentless judgment begins to soften as you develop a more realistic and accepting relationship with your full humanity. Self-forgiveness becomes possible when you understand that your failures and shortcomings are not aberrations, but natural expressions of the human condition. This self-acceptance creates space for genuine growth and transformation rather than The endless cycle of self-improvement that tries to eliminate rather than integrate the shadow. Your emotional range expands as you reclaim feelings that were previously forbidden or suppressed. Anger becomes a source of energy and clarity rather than something to be ashamed of. Sadness deepens your capacity for empathy and connection. Fear sharpens your intuition and protective instincts. Even apparently negative emotions like jealousy or resentment reveal themselves as messengers carrying important information about your needs, values, and boundaries. This emotional integration creates what Jung called psychological differentiation, the ability to experience the full spectrum of human feeling without being overwhelmed or compulsively driven by any particular emotion. You develop what might be described as emotional literacy, the capacity to read the subtle languages of feeling in yourself and others with increasing sophistication and accuracy. The uncomfortable truths you can now hold extend beyond individual psychology to encompass existential realities that most people work hard to avoid. You can look directly at mortality, meaninglessness, suffering, and injustice without requiring immediate solutions or philosophical explanations to make them bearable. This capacity for what existentialists call anxiety tolerance allows you to engage with life's deepest questions and challenges without the defensive mechanisms that usually protect consciousness from overwhelming truth. This growing comfort with discomfort, this capacity to remain present with what is, rather than fleeing toward what ought to be, marks you as someone operating on a frequency of consciousness that few can sustain. You have learned what every mystic and depth psychologist eventually discovers: the truth, however uncomfortable, is infinitely more nourishing to the soul than the most beautiful illusion. In becoming a clear mirror for reality, both its beauty and its darkness, you serve not only your own individuation, but the collective human journey toward greater consciousness and authentic wholeness. Something extraordinary has awakened within you, a capacity that humanity possessed in its earliest days, but gradually lost as civilization turned its attention toward the outer world of material conquest and rational analysis. You have become fluent in the oldest language on earth, the primordial tongue that speaks not in words but in images, not in concepts but in living symbols that carry the concentrated wisdom of millennia. This is the third sign of your uncommon frequency, your ability to perceive and interpret the symbolic communications that flow continuously between the conscious and unconscious realms of existence. The language of symbols is not learned like French or Spanish, through memorization and practice. It is remembered, like a mother tongue returning to someone who has lived too long in a foreign land. Every night as you surrender to sleep, your psyche opens like a flower to receive the symbolic communications that arise from the depths. What once seemed like random neural static, the chaotic jumble of dream imagery that most people dismiss upon waking, has revealed itself to be a sophisticated communication system, a nightly correspondence between your ego consciousness and the deeper self that guides your individuation journey. Your dreams no longer dissipate like morning mist when you wake. Instead, they linger with the presence of important conversations, carrying emotional weight and symbolic significance that demands attention. You find yourself reaching for your journal before your feet touch the floor, capturing the residual images and narratives that feel too precious to lose. These nocturnal communications arrive with their own internal logic, their own symbolic grammar that grows increasingly familiar as you learn to attend to their messages. Jung understood this symbolic language intimately. His Red Book stands as perhaps the most comprehensive record of one individual's dialogue with the unconscious through symbol and image. Like Jung, you have discovered that the psyche speaks in the ancient tongue of metaphor, myth, and archetype, a language that predates human civilization and connects you to the deepest patterns of meaning that have shaped human consciousness. Since the dawn of awareness, the symbols that appear in your dreams are not merely personal. They are transpersonal, carrying meanings that extend far beyond your individual experience. The snake that appears in your dream connects you not only to your own instinctual wisdom, but to the serpent wisdom of countless cultures, the Ouroboros of alchemy, the Kundalini of Eastern traditions, the healing serpent of Asclepius. Each symbol is a doorway that opens onto vast chambers of collective human experience, archetypal patterns that have been constellated in the human psyche for thousands of years. You have learned to approach these symbolic communications with the reverence of an archaeologist handling ancient artifacts. Each image, each narrative sequence, each emotional tone carries information that can illuminate aspects of your psychological development that remain invisible to rational analysis. The old woman who appears repeatedly in your dreams may represent the wise crone archetype, the aspect of your psyche that carries ancient wisdom and intuitive knowing. The house with rooms you've never explored may symbolize undiscovered aspects of your personality, untapped potentials waiting to be integrated into consciousness. But the symbolic language extends far beyond the realm of dreams. You have begun to notice that the waking world itself speaks in symbols, offering constant commentary on your inner state through the intricate web of correspondences that Jung called synchronicity. These meaningful coincidences no longer seem like random events, but like messages from a deeper intelligence that orchestrates both inner and outer experience according to patterns that transcend the boundaries of individual consciousness. The book that falls open to exactly the passage you need to read, the animal that crosses your path at the precise moment when its symbolic significance provides perfect guidance, the song that plays on the radio just as you're wrestling with the very question its lyrics address. These are not coincidences in the traditional sense. They are expressions of what Jung called the transcendent function, the psyche's capacity to create meaningful connections between seemingly unrelated phenomena, weaving together inner and outer experience into a coherent narrative of personal development. Your ability to perceive these synchronicities has been cultivated through years of patient attention to the subtle patterns that connect psychological states with external events. Like a naturalist learning to read the signs of approaching weather, you have developed sensitivity to the symbolic currents that flow beneath the surface of ordinary experience. This attunement requires a particular quality of consciousness: relaxed but alert, open but discerning, receptive to meaning without imposing preconceived interpretations. The world has become for you what it was for Jung, a living mandala of meaning, where every element contributes to an ever-evolving pattern of significance. You read the landscape like a text, recognizing in the cycles of nature reflections of your own psychological seasons. The bare branches of winter trees speak to you of necessary periods of dormancy and retreat. The first green shoots of spring mirror the emergence of new psychological possibilities that have been gestating in the darkness of the unconscious. Even the most mundane experiences carry symbolic weight when perceived through this awakened consciousness. The traffic jam that delays your arrival at an appointment may represent the psyche's wisdom about timing, suggesting that you are not yet ready for what awaits. The mechanical breakdown that forces you to slow down may be the self's way of insisting on the rest and reflection that your ego consciousness has been avoiding. Every obstacle becomes a teacher, every delay a message about the organic timing of psychological development. This symbolic perception extends to your relationships with others, allowing you to see beneath the surface of social interactions to the archetypal patterns that are being constellated. You recognize when someone is caught in the grip of a complex, when their behavior is being driven by an autonomous psychological content that has temporarily possessed their consciousness. You see the shadow projections that fuel interpersonal conflicts, the archetypal dynamics that play out in family systems, the symbolic roles that people unconsciously assume in group settings. Your capacity to perceive these deeper patterns does not make you a passive observer of human drama. Instead, it allows you to engage more consciously with the symbolic dimensions of your relationships, recognizing when you are being invited to embody a particular archetypal role or when someone is projecting onto you contents from their own unconscious. This awareness creates the possibility for more authentic connection as you learn to relate not just to people's personas, but to the deeper psychological patterns that shape their experience. The symbolic language you have learned to speak includes the rich vocabulary of alchemical imagery that Jung found so illuminating in his exploration of psychological transformation. The nigredo, the blackening or dark night of the soul, becomes a recognizable phase in your own development rather than simply a period of depression or confusion. The albedo, the whitening that represents the emergence of new clarity, carries personal significance as you recognize it in your own cycles of insight and understanding. The rubedo, the reddening that symbolizes the integration of passion and spirit, becomes a lived experience rather than an abstract concept. You have discovered that your own psychological development follows the same archetypal patterns that are encoded in myth, fairy tale, and religious narrative. The hero's journey, with its stages of departure, initiation, and return, provides a map for understanding your own periods of transition and transformation. The death and rebirth motifs that appear in countless spiritual traditions offer guidance for navigating the ego dissolutions that are necessary for psychological growth. The sacred marriage of opposites becomes a lived process as you learn to integrate conflicting aspects of your personality into a more complex and authentic wholeness. This fluency in symbolic language has awakened in you a particular form of intelligence that transcends the linear, rational thinking that dominates conventional education and culture. You think in images, metaphors, and patterns, allowing seemingly unrelated elements to combine in your consciousness until new insights emerge. This symbolic thinking is not less rigorous than rational analysis. It is differently rigorous, following the logic of the unconscious rather than the logic of the ego. Your creative expressions, whether in art, writing, or simply in the way you arrange your living space, carry symbolic significance that extends beyond personal preference. You find yourself drawn to certain colors, shapes, and compositions, not because they are aesthetically pleasing, but because they carry symbolic meaning that resonates with your current psychological state. Your creative work becomes a form of active imagination, a way of dialoguing with unconscious contents through symbolic expression. The symbolic language you have learned to speak also includes the subtle communications of the body, the somatic, expressions of psychological states that most people ignore or misinterpret. You recognize that physical symptoms often carry symbolic meaning, that the body speaks in its own metaphorical language about psychological conflicts and developmental needs. This awareness does not replace medical care, but adds another layer of meaning to your understanding of health and illness as expressions of the total personality. Your relationship with time has been transformed by your symbolic perception. You recognize that psychological time follows different rhythms than clock time, that certain developments can only unfold according to their own organic timing. You learn to read the signs that indicate when you are in a period of psychological germination, when patience and receptivity are required, and when you are in a phase of active development that calls for conscious participation and effort. The symbolic language you have awakened to is not a code to be cracked, but a living communication system that grows richer and more nuanced as your relationship with it deepens. Each symbol is a seed that can germinate into new understanding when given the proper conditions of attention and reflection. The same symbol may carry different meanings at different stages of your development, revealing new layers of significance as your consciousness expands to accommodate greater complexity and depth. This awakening to symbolic communication marks you as someone who has remembered humanity's oldest way of knowing, a form of consciousness that perceives the world as ensouled, meaningful and responsive to the deeper patterns of psychological development. In a culture that has largely forgotten this ancient wisdom, your symbolic fluency becomes a bridge between the rational consciousness of modernity and the symbolic consciousness that once connected humanity to the living depths of existence. There is a fire that burns in the depths of the human soul, not the destructive flame that consumes and leaves only ash, but the sacred fire of the ancient alchemists, the divine flame that transforms base metal into gold. This is the fourth sign of your uncommon frequency, your intimate, even welcoming relationship with the alchemical process of inner transformation. Where others flee from the heat of psychological change, you have learned to recognize it as the sacred crucible in which the authentic self is forged. The old alchemists understood something that modern psychology has only recently begun to rediscover, that the most profound transformations occur not through gentle, gradual adjustment, but through periods of intense psychological heat that dissolve the existing structures of identity and reconstitute them at a higher level of integration. They called this process the opus contra naturam, the work against nature, recognizing that consciousness, left to its own devices, tends towards stagnation and comfortable repetition rather than the difficult work of genuine transformation. You have become an alchemist of the soul, intimately familiar with the stages of psychological transformation that the ancients encoded in their mysterious symbols and cryptic formulas. The nigredo, that initial phase of blackening and dissolution, no longer terrifies you as it once did. You have learned to recognize the onset of this dark phase, not as a sign of failure or pathology, but as the necessary prelude to rebirth. When the familiar structures of your identity begin to crack and crumble, when the roles and relationships that once provided security reveal themselves as outgrown shells, you do not panic. You prepare for descent. This capacity to welcome crisis as catalyst sets you apart from those who still believe that psychological health means the absence of disturbance, that spiritual development should proceed along smooth, predictable pathways. You have discovered what every genuine mystic and depth psychologist eventually learns, that the most profound growth occurs during periods of maximum instability, when the ego's carefully constructed defenses are overwhelmed by forces beyond its control and understanding. The nigredo arrives in your life wearing many faces. Sometimes it comes as external crisis, the loss of a job, the end of a relationship, the death of someone beloved, the collapse of a cherished dream. Sometimes it emerges from within as a kind of spiritual emergency, a sudden recognition that the life you have been living no longer fits the person you are becoming. The forms vary, but the essence remains constant, the dismantling of an old way of being to make space for something unprecedented to emerge. During these periods of dissolution, you have learned to distinguish between the voice of the ego, which cries out in panic at the loss of familiar structures, and the voice of the self, which whispers of possibilities that can only be born from the ashes of what has been burned away. The ego experiences the nigredo as pure loss, as evidence that something has gone terribly wrong. But you have developed the capacity to hear beneath its protests the deeper wisdom of the psyche, which knows that certain forms of death are necessary preludes to resurrection. This is perhaps the most difficult aspect of the alchemical path. Learning to trust the process even when it feels like annihilation. The dark night of the soul, as St. John of the Cross named it, strips away not only the structures of identity that have become too small, but also the familiar reference points that normally provide orientation and meaning. You find yourself in a psychological landscape that resembles nothing you have known before, where the old maps no longer apply and the new territory has yet to reveal its contours. Jung understood this process intimately through his own encounter with the unconscious, documented in the Red Book as his nekaya, his descent into the underworld of the psyche. Like Dante guided by Virgil through the circles of hell, you have learned to navigate these dark passages with a combination of courage and surrender, active engagement and passive receptivity. You have discovered that the nigredo is not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be lived. Not a depression to be cured, but a sacred process to be honored. The fire that burns during these transformative periods is not metaphorical, but experiential. You feel it as a literal heat in your body, an intensity of sensation that can be both excruciating and exhilarating. It burns in your chest when old grief finally finds its voice, in your throat when truths that have been suppressed demand expression, in your belly when instinctual wisdom rises to challenge rational certainties. This is the fire of the alchemical furnace, the sacred heat that separates the essential from the superficial, the authentic from the imitative. Where others might seek to extinguish this fire through medication, distraction, or premature closure, you have learned to tend it with the skill of a master alchemist. You know when to increase the heat through conscious engagement with the transformative process and when to moderate it through rest, retreat, and gentle self-care. You understand that the fire must burn at exactly the right temperature. Too cool and no transformation occurs. Too hot and the delicate structures of emerging consciousness are destroyed. This relationship with the transformative fire has taught you patience with the organic timing of psychological change. You no longer try to force insights or manufacture breakthroughs through willpower and determination. Instead, you have learned to create the conditions in which transformation can occur naturally, just as the alchemists learned to maintain the proper temperature and atmosphere in their laboratories, while allowing the mysterious process of transmutation to unfold according to its own inherent wisdom. The albedo, the whitening phase that follows the nigredo, arrives like dawn after the longest night. New clarity emerges from the chaos of dissolution. Fresh perspectives crystallize from the soup of confused emotion and fragmented thought. But you have learned not to grasp too quickly at these moments of illumination, understanding that premature crystallization can interrupt the alchemical process before it reaches completion. You allow the new insights to percolate slowly into consciousness, testing their validity through lived experience rather than accepting them as final truths. This phase of clarification brings with it a particular kind of joy, not the excitement of acquisition, but the deep satisfaction of recognition. You are not gaining something foreign to your nature, but recovering something that was always yours, buried beneath layers of conditioning and false identification. The philosopher's stone, that legendary substance that transforms base metals into gold, reveals itself not as an object to be found, but as a capacity to be developed. The ability to transmute the raw materials of experience into wisdom, suffering into compassion, confusion into clarity. The rubedo, the final reddening that completes the alchemical cycle, integrates the clarity of the albedo with the passion and vitality that were refined in the fires of the nigredo. This is not a return to the original state, but a spiraling back at a higher level of integration. You embody the fruits of your transformation, not as concepts to be understood, but as qualities to be lived. The gold that has been produced in your inner laboratory is not something you possess, but something you have become. This cyclical understanding of transformation has freed you from the linear model of progress that dominates conventional approaches. To personal development, you no longer expect to solve your psychological challenges once and for all, but rather to engage with them at ever deeper levels as your capacity for consciousness expands. Each return to familiar themes, abandonment, betrayal, mortality, meaning, occurs with greater depth and sophistication, like a spiral staircase that revisits the same coordinates while ascending to higher levels of understanding. Your relationship with breakdown has been fundamentally transformed through this alchemical understanding. What once felt like failure now reveals itself as fertile ground for breakthrough. The moments when your carefully constructed life falls apart are no longer experienced as random catastrophes, but as meaningful communications from the self, indicating that you have outgrown your current form and are ready for the next stage of individuation. This perspective allows you to support others through their own transformative crises with a quality of presence that is both compassionate and non-anxious. You can sit with someone in their nigredo without trying to fix, cheer, or rush them toward premature resolution. You understand that their suffering is not meaningless, but meaningful, not pathological, but necessary, not a sign that something has gone wrong, but evidence that something profound is trying to be born. The alchemical fire burns not only in individual transformation, but in the collective processes of cultural and social change. You recognize the same patterns operating on larger scales: the dissolution of outmoded structures, the emergence of new possibilities from apparent chaos, the necessity of crisis in catalyzing evolutionary development. This recognition helps you maintain perspective during periods of collective upheaval, understanding them as part of a larger transformative process rather than simply as breakdown and decay. Your body has become a sensitive instrument for detecting the presence of this transformative fire, both in yourself and in the environments you enter. You can sense when someone is in the midst of their own alchemical process, when situations are ripe for transformation, when the conditions are aligned for breakthrough or breakdown. This somatic wisdom allows you to position yourself consciously in relationship to these powerful forces, neither avoiding them out of fear nor seeking them out of spiritual ambition. The fire of transformation has taught you to distinguish between the ego's desires for change and the self's requirements for growth. The ego wants transformation to be comfortable, predictable, and under its control. It seeks change that enhances its image and strengthens its position. But the self demands transformation that serves wholeness rather than ego-aggrandizement, that honors truth rather than preference, that follows the deep rhythms of psychological development rather than the surface urgencies of personal will. This discrimination allows you to recognize when you are in authentic transformation versus when you are simply rearranging the furniture of your personality. True alchemical change always involves some degree of ego death, some release of identifications that have become too small to contain your expanding consciousness. It requires the courage to let go of who you have been in order to become who you are meant to be. The sacred fire that burns within you has become a beacon for others who are ready to undertake their own alchemical journey. Your willingness to embrace transformation, to welcome crisis as catalyst, to find meaning in breakdown, creates permission for others to engage with their own transformative processes. You become a living example of the possibility that exists. Within apparent destruction, a demonstration that the fire of transformation, however intense, ultimately serves the emergence of authentic selfhood. In learning to work consciously with the alchemical fire, you have recovered an ancient wisdom that connects you to the deepest traditions of human transformation. You have joined the ranks of those who understand that true gold is not found but made, not discovered in the external world, but forged in the crucible of conscious suffering and courageous self-examination. The philosopher's stone you have been seeking reveals itself as the capacity to transform any experience, however difficult, into an opportunity for deeper authenticity and more complete wholeness. There comes a moment in the soul's great journey when you realize that the very questions you once sought to answer were the wrong questions entirely. You were asking which path to take when the path itself was learning to walk in two directions at once. You were demanding certainty from a universe that speaks only in whispers and contradictions, seeking solid ground in a reality that exists primarily in the spaces between things. This is the territory of the paradox holder, the one who has learned to cradle opposing truths like twin flames in cupped palms, neither extinguishing the other, but allowing both to burn with equal intensity. Here, in this sacred space of suspended resolution, you encounter the fifth sign of your deep transformation. Your capacity to hold paradox without the desperate need to collapse it into the comfortable prison of either-or thinking. The world around you continues its ancient dance of polarization. Everywhere you look, consciousness fragments itself into opposing camps, each clutching half-truths like shields against the unbearable complexity of existence. Light battles shadow, good wars against evil, right struggles with wrong, the collective. Psyche, in its infantile terror of ambiguity, demands that every mystery be solved, every contradiction resolved, every paradox flattened into manageable categories. But you have learned to breathe in the space between breath and no breath. You have discovered that the most profound truths live not in the answers, but in the eternal tension between opposing forces. You have become a living embodiment of what Jung called enantiodromia, the principle that all psychological extremes eventually transform into their opposites, that the psyche's deepest wisdom lies not in choosing sides, but in dancing with the eternal interplay of forces that seem to contradict each other, yet somehow create the very fabric of existence. Consider how you move through your daily life now, carrying within you the recognition that every virtue contains the seed of its corresponding vice, that every strength harbors its own weakness, that every light casts its own shadow. When others around you rage against the darkness in the world, you hold the mystery that this very darkness might be the fertile soil from which new consciousness grows. When they celebrate only the light, you sense the shadow that such one-sided devotion inevitably creates. This is not the paralysis of the chronically indecisive, nor is it the cynicism of those who believe that nothing matters because everything is relative. The paradox holder lives in a different dimension entirely, one where opposites don't cancel each other out, but create a dynamic tension that generates new possibilities, new forms of understanding, new ways of being human. You have learned to love your enemy not because you are a saint, but because you recognize that your enemy often carries the very medicine your soul needs for its continued growth. You have discovered that your greatest weaknesses, when embraced rather than rejected, become doorways to unexpected strengths. You hold the paradox that you must lose yourself to find yourself, that you must die to be reborn, that you must descend into darkness to discover your own light. In your relationships, this capacity for paradox transforms you into a different kind of presence altogether. Where others demand consistency, you offer authenticity, which includes the right to be inconsistent, to grow, to change, to contradict yesterday's self in service of today's truth. You no longer try to be all good or all bad, all strong or all vulnerable, all wise or all foolish. Instead, you allow yourself to be fully human, which means being a walking contradiction, a living paradox, a beautiful impossibility. You hold the paradox of intimacy, that true closeness requires the courage to be separate, that real love demands the freedom to not love, that the deepest connections happen when two people can meet as sovereign beings rather than as halves desperately seeking their missing pieces. In your friendships, your partnerships, your family relationships, you no longer try to resolve the fundamental tensions that make relationships challenging. Instead, you dance with these tensions, finding in them the very energy that keeps relationships alive and growing. The paradox holder understands that anger and love are not opposites, but dance partners, that the intensity of your rage often mirrors the depth of your care. You no longer try to be spiritual by eliminating your darkness, nor do you try to be authentic by rejecting your light. You hold both. You honor both. You allow both to inform your choices and shape your path. In your work, your creativity, your contribution to the world, this capacity for paradox becomes a source of incredible power. While others exhaust themselves trying to maintain perfect consistency, you draw energy from the dynamic tension between your various aspects. You can be simultaneously confident and humble, ambitious and content, passionate and detached. You can care deeply while holding lightly, commit fully while remaining fluid, lead with authority while following with grace. The paradox holder recognizes that the ego's desperate need for certainty is itself a form of unconsciousness. The ego wants to know, to control, to categorize, to build walls between self and other, between good and bad, between sacred and profane. But you have touched something deeper than ego. You have encountered the self that Jung spoke of, that transcendent function that emerges when opposites are held in creative tension rather than resolved through force. This self doesn't think in terms of either or, but in terms of both and. It doesn't seek to eliminate contradiction, but to find the hidden unity that encompasses all contradictions. It doesn't demand that life makes sense according to rational categories, but recognizes that life's deepest meaning often emerges from the places where reason reaches its limits and must bow to mystery. You have learned to hold the paradox of your own spiritual journey, that the closer you come to enlightenment, the more aware you become of your own darkness, that the more you understand, the more you realize how much you don't know, that the more you heal, the more sensitive you become to the places that still need healing. This is not failure. This is the natural progression of consciousness, awakening to its own infinite depth. The paradox holder no longer seeks to transcend the human condition, but to embrace it so fully that transcendence happens naturally, effortlessly. Without the effort of transcendence, you have discovered that the very attempt to escape your humanity is what keeps you trapped in suffering, while the complete acceptance of your humanity is what opens the door to divine possibility. In your daily encounters with others, you have become a keeper of nuance in a world addicted to simplification. When someone tells you their story of victimization, you can hold compassion for their pain while also sensing the ways they might be unconsciously perpetuating their own suffering. When someone shares their triumph, you can celebrate their success, while remaining aware of the shadow that success often casts. You offer neither false reassurance nor cruel judgment, but something far more valuable, the gift of being truly seen in all your complexity. This capacity to hold paradox transforms your relationship with your own past. You no longer need to categorize your experiences as purely positive or purely negative. You can simultaneously grieve the pain you endured and feel grateful for the wisdom it brought. You can acknowledge the damage done by those who hurt you, while also recognizing the unconscious gifts they gave you. You can honor your younger self's choices while also recognizing their limitations. You hold it all, the beauty and the tragedy, the wisdom and the foolishness, the light and the shadow. The paradox holder understands that healing doesn't mean fixing or eliminating problems, but rather developing a different relationship with the very forces that once felt like enemies. Your anxiety becomes a teacher of presence. Your depression becomes a call to depth. Your anger becomes a guardian of your boundaries. Your fear becomes a guide to what you most need to embrace. Nothing is wasted. Nothing is purely negative. Nothing exists outside the great dance of opposites that creates the very possibility of consciousness itself. You have learned to trust the paradoxical nature of growth itself, that we must often move backward to go forward, that we must sometimes fall apart to come together in new ways, that we must die to old versions of ourselves to be born into greater authenticity. The linear mind rebels against this understanding, but the deeper psyche recognizes it as fundamental law. Just as the seasons cycle through death and rebirth, so too does consciousness move through its own seasons of dissolution and renewal. In holding paradox, you become a bridge between worlds, between the conscious and unconscious, between the individual and collective, between the human and divine. You no longer live exclusively in any one realm, but move fluidly between them, translating the wisdom of one dimension into the language of another. You speak the tongue of both mind and heart, both body and spirit, both time and eternity. This is perhaps the most challenging aspect of being a paradox holder. Others often misunderstand your refusal to take sides in conflicts that they see as clearly black and white. They may interpret your complexity as wishy-washiness, your nuance as lack of conviction, your embrace of contradiction as moral confusion. But you have learned that true moral clarity often requires the courage to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously, to resist the seductive simplicity of absolute positions. The paradox holder recognizes that the most important questions cannot be answered but must be lived. The question of meaning cannot be solved intellectually, but must be embodied through the choices you make moment by moment. The question of purpose cannot be figured out, but must be discovered through your willingness to show up authentically to whatever life presents. The question of truth cannot be grasped, but must be allowed to grasp you, to live through you, to express itself as your very existence. You have become a living example of what Jung called the transcendent function, the psychological process that emerges when opposing forces within the psyche are held in creative tension rather than resolved through one-sided identification. This function doesn't eliminate conflict, but transforms it, doesn't solve problems, but transcends them by creating new contexts in which old problems become irrelevant. As you continue to mature in your capacity to hold paradox, you discover that this is not an achievement to be maintained, but a way of being to be continually deepened. Each day presents new opportunities to practice holding opposing truths, to resist the ego's demand for certainty, to dance with ambiguity as a partner rather than fighting it as an enemy. You become increasingly comfortable with not knowing, increasingly at peace with contradiction, increasingly skilled at finding the hidden unity that underlies all apparent opposition. The world needs paradox holders now more than ever. In a time of increasing polarization, when collective consciousness seems to be splitting into irreconcilable camps, your capacity to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously becomes a gift to the healing of the whole. You become a living demonstration that it is possible to disagree without demonizing, to have strong convictions without becoming rigid, to stand for something without standing against everything else. This is the profound initiation of the paradox holder, learning to love what you cannot understand, to trust what you cannot control, to embrace what you cannot resolve. In doing so, you become a vessel for the very creative force that brought the universe into being, that force which thrives on paradox, which creates through the eternal dance of opposing energies, which finds its greatest expression in the impossible, possibility of consciousness itself, that miraculous paradox of matter becoming aware of itself, of the finite touching the infinite, of the temporal glimpsing the eternal. You are the paradox holder, and in holding paradox, you hold the very heart of existence itself. In the ancient halls of your psyche, there exists a room you once tried desperately to seal shut. Behind its heavy door lay your deepest wound, that original tear in the fabric of your being that seemed to define the very parameters of your suffering. For years, perhaps decades, you believed that healing meant finding a way to close this wound forever, to emerge from your psychological work as someone who had transcended pain, who had outgrown vulnerability, who had finally become invulnerable to the sharp edges of existence. But then came the great turning, the moment when you realized that the very wound you had been trying to heal was actually trying to heal you. This is the sixth sign of your profound transformation, your evolved relationship with your deepest vulnerabilities, your discovery that the places where you are most broken are often the places where light enters not just your world, but the world through you. You have become the wounded healer, that ancient archetype that appears in every culture and mythology because it speaks to a fundamental truth about human consciousness, that our greatest gifts often emerge not despite our wounds, but because of them. The shaman who journeys to the underworld and returns with medicine for the tribe. The therapist whose own darkness allows them to sit with others in theirs. The artist whose pain becomes the raw material for beauty that heals not just themselves, but everyone who encounters their work. Your wound is no longer your enemy. It has become your teacher, your guide, your most trusted ally in the work of becoming fully human, where once you experienced your sensitivity as a curse, that raw, exposed quality that made you feel everything too deeply, that left you overwhelmed by the intensity of your own emotional life. You now recognize it as a finely tuned instrument capable of perceiving subtleties that others miss entirely. This transformation did not happen overnight. It required a complete reversal of your relationship with suffering itself. You had to learn to stop running from your pain and start running toward it, not with masochistic intent, but with the understanding that your pain was not random, not meaningless, not a mistake to be corrected. Your pain was information, precious, specific information about the places where life was calling you to grow, to deepen, to expand your capacity for both feeling and healing. The wound that teaches is never just personal. It is always transpersonal, always connected to the larger patterns of human suffering and human healing. Your particular configuration of sensitivity, your specific way of being vulnerable, your unique pattern of breaking and mending, these are not accidents of fate, but precise instruments designed by the psyche to serve not just your own individuation, but the healing of the collective unconscious itself. You discovered this truth gradually, perhaps through noticing how often people were drawn to share their deepest struggles with you. Not because you had figured everything out, but because you had learned to sit with the unfigured-out places in yourself. Your wound had taught you the language of empathy, had given you access to emotional territories that those who had never been broken in quite your way could never fully understand. Your sensitivity, once experienced as overwhelm, became discernment. Your tendency toward depression, once seen as pathology, became a capacity for depth that allows you to perceive the hidden sadness in others and offer them the gift of being truly seen in their sorrow. Your anxiety, once a source of shame, became an early warning system that helps you navigate the complex energies of relationships and situations with unprecedented awareness. The wound that teaches does not heal in the conventional sense. It transforms. It stops being something that happens to you and becomes something that happens through you. It ceases to be a limitation and becomes a specialization, a unique way of knowing and being that contributes something irreplaceable to the healing of the world. This understanding completely revolutionizes your relationship with your own history. The abuse you survived, the abandonment you endured, the betrayals that shattered your trust, the losses that broke your heart, none of these experiences disappear from your story, but they stop being merely personal tragedies and become initiations into deeper levels of compassion and wisdom. You begin to see how your particular wounds have carved out spaces in your psyche that can now hold the wounds of others. The parent who wounded you becomes, in the alchemy of deep healing, the one who gave you your capacity to recognize and heal. The wounded child in every person you meet. The lover who betrayed you becomes the one who taught you to distinguish between genuine intimacy and its counterfeits, a skill you now use to help others navigate their own relationships with greater awareness. The friend who abandoned you becomes the one who showed you the preciousness of true loyalty, making you someone who treasures and protects the bonds that matter. You understand now what Jung meant when he said that we are not here to be cured of our essential nature, but to transform our relationship with it. Your essential nature includes your sensitivity, your capacity for deep feeling, your tendency to be affected by the subtle energies that others don't even notice. These qualities will never disappear, nor should they. They are not bugs in your psychological programming. They are features, carefully designed aspects of your particular contribution to the great work of human consciousness. The wounded healer knows that healing is not about becoming someone else, but about becoming more fully yourself, including the wounded parts of yourself. It is about integrating rather than eliminating, about transformation rather than transcendence, about finding meaning and purpose within your vulnerabilities rather than despite them. This integration requires a fundamental shift in how you understand strength and weakness. The old paradigm taught you that strength meant invulnerability, that power meant the ability to remain unaffected by life's inevitable challenges. But the wounded healer discovers a different kind of strength, the strength to remain open even after being hurt, the power to love even after being betrayed, the courage to trust even after being disappointed. Your wound becomes a source of authentic power, because it connects you to the universal human experience of suffering and the equally universal human capacity for resilience. It makes you real in a world full of personas, genuine in a culture of facades, deeply human in a society that often seems to reward the denial of humanity. This authenticity draws others to you like moths to flame. They sense in you someone who has been where they are, someone who knows the territory of pain from the inside, someone who has found a way to transform suffering into wisdom without bypassing the suffering itself. You become a living proof that it is possible to be both wounded and whole, both broken and beautiful, both vulnerable and powerful. The wound that teaches also teaches you about timing, about the sacred rhythms of healing and growth. You learn that there are seasons for opening and seasons for protecting, times for sharing your story and times for holding it close, moments when your wound needs tending and moments when it can tend to others. You develop an intuitive understanding of when to speak from your pain and when to speak from the wisdom your pain has given you. This discrimination is crucial because the wounded healer must learn to avoid the trap of identifying too completely with their wound. The wound is not who you are. It is something that happened to you, something that has shaped you, something that continues to inform your work in the world. But you are larger than your wound, more complex than your pain, more magnificent than your damage. The wounded healer learns to dance with their wound rather than being consumed by it. Sometimes you lead, drawing on the wisdom your wound has given you to help others navigate similar territories. Sometimes your wound leads, calling you deeper into your own healing journey, reminding you that you are both healer and patient, both teacher and student, both guide and pilgrim on the path of becoming whole. Your wound teaches you about the interconnectedness of all healing. You realize that when you heal, you contribute to the healing of your family system, your community, your generation. When you find ways to transform your pain into medicine, you add to the collective store of wisdom about how to alchemize suffering into gold. Your individual healing becomes a gift to the entire human family. This understanding brings with it a sense of sacred responsibility. You recognize that your wound is not just yours. It belongs to all those who share similar vulnerabilities, all those who struggle with similar patterns of pain. In healing your wound, you help heal the archetypal wound that your personal experience represents. In transforming your relationship with your sensitivity, you make it easier for other sensitive souls to embrace their own nature. The wound that teaches also teaches you about the medicine you came here to bring. You discover that your unique way of being broken has prepared you to offer a unique form of healing. The specific constellation of your wounds has created a specific constellation of gifts, and no one else can offer exactly what you have to give. Your medicine is irreplaceable because your wound is irreplaceable. This realization fills you with a profound sense of purpose. You are not randomly wounded. You are specifically wounded for a reason. Your pain is not meaningless. It is meaningful in ways you are only beginning to understand. Your sensitivity is not a mistake. It is a calling, a vocation, a sacred assignment from the depths of your own soul. As you mature in your role as wounded healer, you develop increasingly sophisticated ways of working with your wound. You learn when to open it and when to let it rest, when to share from it and when to protect it, when to use it as a source of empathy and when to maintain healthy boundaries. You become an artist of your own vulnerability, skilled at using your sensitivity as a tool for healing rather than a source of endless suffering. The wound that teaches ultimately teaches you about the nature of wholeness itself. Wholeness is not the absence of wounds. It is the integration of wounds into a larger pattern of meaning and purpose. It is not about becoming invulnerable, but about becoming increasingly capable of finding value and wisdom in your vulnerability. It is not about transcending your humanity, but about embracing it so completely that your very humanity becomes a gift to the world. You understand now that your wound will always be with you, but its presence in your life has been completely transformed. It no longer dominates your identity or defines your limitations. Instead, it serves as a constant reminder of your capacity for resilience, your ability to find meaning in suffering, your power to transform poison into medicine. It has become not the thing that breaks you, but the thing that makes you, not your greatest weakness, but your greatest strength. The wounded healer stands at the intersection of pain and possibility, of brokenness and beauty, of individual suffering and collective healing. You have learned to inhabit this intersection with grace, to serve from this place with wisdom, to offer your wound as a gift to a world that desperately needs the medicine that only the wounded can provide. In doing so, you fulfill one of the most sacred roles in human consciousness, the one who transforms suffering into service, pain into purpose, wounds into wisdom. This is the profound teaching of the wound that teaches that our deepest pain, when met with consciousness and courage, becomes our deepest gift, that our greatest vulnerabilities, when embraced rather than rejected, become our greatest strengths, that our wounds, when tended with love and wisdom, become sources of healing not just for ourselves, but for all those whose lives we touch with our transformed understanding of what it means to be beautifully, brokenly, magnificently human. There, comes a moment in your psychological awakening when the veil lifts not just from your personal unconscious, but from the vast, churning depths of the collective psyche itself. This is perhaps the most isolating and illuminating of all transformations, the moment when you begin to perceive the invisible threads that puppet entire populations, the archetypal forces that sweep through human consciousness like weather systems, leaving entire generations unconsciously possessed by energies they neither recognize nor understand. This is the seventh sign of your deep transformation. Your capacity to see through the collective trance, to perceive the unconscious patterns that drive mass behavior, to recognize when entire societies become vessels for archetypal energies that play out on the world stage with devastating or redemptive consequences. Like Jung himself, witnessing the dark possession that gripped Germany in the 1930s, you have developed the unsettling gift of seeing when the collective shadow erupts into the light of day, masquerading as righteousness, progress, or necessity. Standing in this awareness is like being awake in a world of sleepwalkers. You watch as masses of people move in synchronized patterns they believe are their own conscious choices, unaware that they are dancing to rhythms played by forces far older and more powerful than their individual wills. You see the projection mechanisms at work on a massive scale, entire nations casting their disowned shadows onto other nations, whole populations finding scapegoats for their collective guilt, enormous groups of people possessed by archetypal energies that turn them into unconscious actors in dramas that have been playing out since the dawn of human consciousness. The loneliness of this perception cannot be overstated. To see clearly when others are blind, to remain conscious when consciousness itself seems to be under attack, to maintain psychological equilibrium while witnessing the collective descent into possession. This is one of the heaviest burdens the individuated soul must bear. You find yourself a stranger in your own culture, an alien in your own time, watching with both horror and fascination as the great archetypal dramas unfold through the unwitting participation of millions. You observe how the collective psyche, when under stress, regresses to more primitive levels of functioning. Fear spreads like contagion, reducing complex individuals to members of a frightened herd. Rational discourse gives way to tribal thinking. Nuance disappears in favor of stark polarizations. The capacity for individual reflection vanishes as people lose themselves in the intoxicating power of mass identity. But your perception goes deeper than mere social observation. You see the archetypal underpinnings of these collective movements. You recognize when the Dark Father archetype possesses a political leader, turning them into a vessel for authoritarian control. You witness the emergence of the Terrible Mother in ideologies that promise to take care of everyone by removing their freedom to choose. You see the Puer Eternus, the eternal child, manifesting in movements that demand immediate gratification, while rejecting the slow, difficult work of genuine transformation. Most disturbing of all, you perceive how collective shadow projection works on a massive scale. You watch as entire populations split off the dark aspects of their own nature and project them onto designated enemies, other races, other nations, other political parties, other religious groups. The projected shadow becomes the repository for everything the collective cannot bear to acknowledge about itself. The enemy becomes supernaturally evil, while the projecting group sees itself as purely good, purely victim, purely righteous. This dynamic creates what Jung called a collective possession, moments when large groups of people become unconscious, vehicles for archetypal energies. During these possessions, individual conscience becomes subordinated to group thinking. Personal responsibility dissolves into collective identity. The capacity for self-reflection disappears as people lose themselves in the hypnotic power of belonging to something larger than themselves. You recognize these possessions not only in obviously extreme manifestations like fascism or fundamentalism, but in subtler forms that permeate everyday culture. You see how consumer culture possesses people with the archetype of the hungry ghost, beings with enormous appetites and tiny mouths, forever consuming but never satisfied. You observe how social media creates possession by the exhibitionist. Archetype, turning private individuals into performers desperate for validation from invisible audiences. You witness the possession of entire industries by archetypal energies. The medical establishment becomes possessed by the wounded healer's shadow, the compulsion to cure rather than heal, to treat symptoms rather than causes, to maintain dependency rather than foster genuine health. The educational system falls under the spell of the authoritarian parent, more concerned with compliance than curiosity, more invested in conformity than creativity. In the political realm, you see archetypal possession playing out with particular intensity. Politicians become vessels for the energies their constituencies need to project. The savior archetype possesses leaders who promise to solve all problems through their unique wisdom and power. The warrior archetype takes hold of those who frame every issue as a battle to be won, rather than a problem to be solved. The trickster emerges in those who gain power through deception and manipulation, turning the political process into an elaborate game with no rules except winning. Your perception of these collective patterns brings with it a profound sense of responsibility. You understand that consciousness is not just a personal achievement, but a collective necessity. When unconsciousness dominates the collective psyche, the results can be catastrophic: wars, genocides, environmental destruction, the collapse of civilizations. Your individual consciousness becomes a small but vital contribution to the overall level of awareness in the human species. This responsibility often feels overwhelming. How can your single awareness make any difference against the vast tide of collective unconsciousness? How can your individual clarity penetrate the fog of mass delusion? How can you maintain your sanity while remaining aware of collective insanity? The answer lies in understanding that consciousness itself is archetypal. It has its own pattern, its own energy, its own way of spreading through the collective psyche. Just as unconsciousness can be contagious, so can consciousness. Your awareness creates ripples that spread outward, touching other individuals who are ready to wake up, who are tired of being unconscious vehicles for forces they don't understand. You learn to work with collective unconscious patterns rather than simply opposing them. You understand that resistance often strengthens the very forces you're trying to change, that consciousness spreads through attraction rather than argument, through example rather than explanation. You become a tuning fork of awareness, your very presence, helping others remember their own capacity for conscious choice. This work requires tremendous discernment. You must learn to distinguish between healthy collective energies and destructive ones, between archetypal patterns that serve human development and those that hinder it. Not all collective movements are possessions. Some represent genuine evolutionary impulses emerging from the depths of the psyche. The civil rights movement, the environmental movement, the movement toward gender equality. These can be seen as positive archetypal energies seeking expression through human consciousness. Your task becomes learning to support these positive collective movements while maintaining your individual awareness, to participate in necessary social changes without losing yourself in group identity, to contribute to collective healing without becoming unconscious. collective psyche. You engage with mass movements and social trends, but from a place of awareness rather than identification. You can feel the pull of collective energies without being controlled by them. You can understand the archetypal significance of historical events without losing your capacity for individual discernment. This conscious participation often requires you to hold paradoxes that others find impossible to tolerate. You can simultaneously support a cause and critique its shadow manifestations. You can recognize the validity of a movement while remaining aware of its potential for unconscious possession. You can participate in collective action while maintaining your individual integrity. Your perception of collective unconscious patterns also transforms your understanding of personal healing. You recognize that many of your individual symptoms are actually manifestations of collective wounds. Your anxiety might be partially personal, but it's also a response to the anxiety that permeates the entire culture. Your depression might have personal roots, but it's also connected to the collective despair that emerges when societies lose their sense of meaning and purpose. This understanding leads to a more complex approach to healing, one that addresses both personal and collective dimensions simultaneously. You work on your individual wounds while also contributing to the healing of the collective wounds that they reflect. You develop personal consciousness while also participating in the development of collective consciousness. The gift of perceiving collective unconscious patterns ultimately serves not just your own individuation, but the individuation of the species itself. You become a conscious participant in the great evolutionary process by which human consciousness learns to recognize and integrate its own shadow, by which collective wisdom slowly emerges from collective foolishness, by which the human family gradually awakens to its own psychological patterns and dynamics. This perception connects you to the long lineage of those who have served as conscious witnesses to their times, the prophets and seers, the artists and visionaries, the depth, psychologists and spiritual teachers who have maintained awareness in the face of collective unconsciousness. You become part of this tradition, adding your own unique perspective to the ongoing attempt to understand and heal the human condition. In your daily life, this awareness manifests as a kind of double vision. You participate in ordinary social interactions while simultaneously perceiving the archetypal undercurrents that flow beneath the surface. You engage with media and culture while remaining aware of the unconscious patterns they both reflect and reinforce. You move through your community while sensing the collective moods and movements that shape individual behavior in ways most people never recognize. This double vision can be exhausting, but it also brings profound meaning to your existence. You are no longer just living your personal life. You are participating consciously in the great drama of human evolution, contributing your awareness to the slow, difficult process by which consciousness emerges from unconsciousness, by which wisdom slowly emerges from confusion, by which healing gradually emerges from woundedness. The seventh sign of your transformation, your ability to perceive collective unconscious patterns, ultimately reveals your role as a conscious agent in the healing of the world. You are not separate from the collective psyche, but a conscious cell within it, helping the larger organism of humanity develop greater self-awareness, greater capacity for choice, greater ability to create rather than merely react. In holding this awareness, you become both witness and participant, observer and healer, individual and collective consciousness. You stand at the intersection of personal and transpersonal psychology, serving as a bridge between the individual unconscious and the collective unconscious, helping to translate the wisdom of depth psychology into lived reality in a world that desperately needs greater consciousness of its own psychological patterns and processes. Deep within the chambers of your soul, a revolution has been quietly taking place. artist of authentic expression, a conduit for the creative energies of the self, rather than the desperate performances of the ego. The shift from ego-driven creation to soul-driven expression marks one of the most profound metamorphoses in the journey of individuation. You can likely remember the exact moment when you realized that everything you had been creating was in service to an image you were trying to maintain, a persona you were trying to perfect, a version of yourself you hoped others would find acceptable. Your art, your words, your choices, all had been carefully crafted to win approval, to avoid rejection, to secure your place in a world that seemed to reward conformity above all else. But then came the great turning away from the audience that lives outside yourself toward the audience that lives within. You discovered that there was something in you that wanted to be expressed regardless of whether anyone else understood it, appreciated it, or even acknowledged its existence. This something arose from depths you had barely known existed, carrying with it an urgency and authenticity that made your previous creations feel like pale imitations of real artistic expression. Your creative impulses now spring from the same source that Jung tapped into during his years of active imagination, that liminal space where the unconscious meets consciousness, where archetypal energies take form through human hands and voices. When you create now, you are not trying to say something clever or beautiful or impressive. You are allowing something to say itself through you, to take form through your unique configuration of experience, skill, and sensitivity. This transformation often begins with a kind of creative crisis. The old motivations stop working. The desire for external validation loses its power to inspire. You may go through periods where you cannot create at all, where the very act of picking up a brush or sitting at a keyboard feels hollow, artificial, impossibly difficult. This is the necessary death that precedes the rebirth of authentic expression. The ego's creative drives must die before the self's creative forces can emerge. During this fallow time, you learn to wait. You learn to trust that creativity is not something you manufacture, but something that moves through you when the conditions are right. You discover that authentic expression requires a kind of receptivity, a willingness to be surprised by what wants to emerge, a capacity to serve forces larger than your personal will or desire. When creation begins again, it carries a completely different quality. Your work becomes numinous, charged with the kind of energy that Jung recognized in genuine psychological material emerging from the unconscious. Others may not understand what you have made, but they sense its power. There is something in your authentic expressions that bypasses the rational mind and speaks directly to the depths of the human psyche, evoking responses that even you cannot fully explain. This authenticity transforms not just what you create, but how you create. You no longer struggle against your limitations, but work with them, recognizing them as the very constraints that give your expression its unique character. Your particular wounds, your specific history, your individual way of seeing. These stop being obstacles to overcome and become the raw materials for something that could never be created by anyone else. You develop what might be called creative integrity, a commitment to expressing what is true for you, regardless of whether it fits current trends, meets market demands, or aligns with others' expectations. This integrity often requires tremendous courage, because authentic expression frequently involves revealing aspects of yourself that you have been taught to hide, speaking truths that others prefer not to hear, creating beauty from materials that society considers ugly or inappropriate. The artist of authentic expression learns to trust the creative process even when it leads into unknown territory. You discover that your best work often emerges from your willingness to follow impulses that make no logical sense, to explore themes that seem support these positive collective movements while maintaining your individual awareness, to participate in necessary social changes without losing yourself in group identity, to contribute to collective healing without becoming unconsciously possessed by even beneficial archetypal energies. You develop what might be called conscious participation in the collective psyche. You engage with mass movements and social trends, but from a place of awareness rather than identification. You can feel the pull of collective energies without being controlled by them. You can understand the archetypal significance of historical events without losing your capacity for individual discernment. This conscious participation often requires you to hold paradoxes that others find impossible to tolerate. You can simultaneously support a cause and critique its shadow manifestations. You can recognize the validity of a movement while remaining aware of its potential for unconscious possession. You can participate in collective action while maintaining your individual integrity. Your perception of collective unconscious patterns also transforms your understanding of personal healing. You recognize that many of your individual symptoms are actually manifestations of collective wounds. Your anxiety might be partially personal, but it's also a response to the anxiety that permeates the entire culture. Your depression might have personal roots, but it's also connected to the collective despair that emerges when societies lose their sense of meaning and purpose. This understanding leads to a more complex approach to healing, one that addresses both personal and collective dimensions simultaneously. You work on your individual wounds while also contributing to the healing of the collective wounds that they reflect. You develop personal consciousness while also participating in the development of collective consciousness, the gift of perceiving. Collective unconscious patterns ultimately serves not just your own individuation, but the individuation of the species itself. You become a conscious participant in the great evolutionary process by which human consciousness learns to recognize and integrate its own shadow, by which collective wisdom slowly emerges from collective foolishness, by which the human family gradually awakens to its own psychological patterns and dynamics. This perception connects you to the long lineage of those who have served as conscious witnesses to their times, the prophets and seers, the artists and visionaries, the depth, psychologists and spiritual teachers who have maintained awareness in the face of collective unconsciousness. You become part of this tradition, adding your own unique perspective to the ongoing attempt to understand and heal the human condition. In your daily life, this awareness manifests as a kind of double vision. You participate in ordinary social interactions while simultaneously perceiving the archetypal undercurrents that flow beneath the surface. You engage with media and culture while remaining aware of the unconscious patterns they both reflect and reinforce. You move through your community while sensing the collective moods and movements that shape individual behavior in ways most people never recognize. This double vision can be exhausting, but it also brings profound meaning to your existence. You are no longer just living your personal life. You are participating consciously in the great drama of human evolution, contributing your awareness to the slow, difficult process by which consciousness emerges from unconsciousness, by which wisdom slowly emerges from confusion, by which healing gradually emerges from woundedness. The seventh sign of your transformation, your ability to perceive collective unconscious patterns, ultimately reveals your role as a conscious agent in the healing of the world. You are not separate from the collective psyche, but a conscious cell within it, helping the larger organism of humanity develop greater self-awareness, greater capacity for choice, greater ability to create rather than merely react. In holding this awareness, you become both witness and participant, observer and healer, individual and collective consciousness. You stand at the intersection of personal and transpersonal psychology. the wisdom of depth psychology into lived reality in a world that desperately needs greater consciousness of its own psychological patterns and processes. Deep within the chambers of your soul, a revolution has been quietly taking place. Where once you created to be seen, to be praised, to be accepted into the circles of approval that seem to define worth in this world, now something entirely different moves through you. Your hands, your voice, your very way of being in the world have become instruments for forces that care nothing for applause and everything for truth. This is the eighth sign of your profound transformation. You have become an artist of authentic expression, a conduit for the creative energies of the self, rather than the desperate performances of the ego. The shift from ego-driven creation to soul-driven expression marks one of the most profound metamorphoses in the journey of individuation. You can likely remember the exact moment when you realized that everything you had been creating was in service to an image you were trying to maintain, a persona you were trying to perfect, a version of yourself you hoped others would find acceptable. Your art, your words, your choices, all had been carefully crafted to win approval, to avoid rejection, to secure your place in a world that seemed to reward conformity above all else. But then came the great turning away from the audience that lives outside yourself toward the audience that lives within. You discovered that there was something in you that wanted to be expressed regardless of whether anyone else understood it, appreciated it, or even acknowledged its existence. This something arose from depths you had barely known existed, carrying with it an urgency and authenticity that made your previous creations feel like pale imitations of real artistic expression. Your creative impulses now spring from the same source that Jung tapped into during his years of active imagination, that liminal space where the unconscious meets consciousness, where archetypal energies take form through human hands and voices. When you create now, you are not trying to say something clever or beautiful or impressive. You are allowing something to say itself through you, to take form through your unique configuration of experience, skill, and sensitivity. This transformation often begins with a kind of creative crisis. The old motivations stop working. The desire for external validation loses its power to inspire. You may go through periods where you cannot create at all, where the very act of picking up a brush or sitting at a keyboard feels hollow, artificial, impossibly difficult. This is the necessary death that precedes the rebirth of authentic expression. The ego's creative drives must die before the self's creative forces can emerge. During this fallow time, you learn to wait. You learn to trust that creativity is not something you manufacture, but something that moves through you when the conditions are right. You discover that authentic expression requires a kind of receptivity, a willingness to be surprised by what wants to emerge, a capacity to serve forces larger than your personal will or desire. When creation begins again, it carries a completely different quality. Your work becomes numinous, charged with the kind of energy that Jung recognized in genuine psychological material emerging from the unconscious. Others may not understand what you have made, but they sense its power. There is something in your authentic expressions that bypasses the rational mind and speaks directly to the depths of the human psyche, evoking responses that even you cannot fully explain. This authenticity transforms not just what you create, but how you create. You no longer struggle against your limitations, but work with them, recognizing them as the very constraints that give your expression its unique character. Your particular wounds, your specific history, your individual way of seeing. These stop being obstacles to overcome and become the raw materials for something that could never be created by anyone else. You develop what might be called what is true for you, regardless of whether it fits current trends, meets market demands, or aligns with others' expectations. This integrity often requires tremendous courage because authentic expression frequently involves revealing aspects of yourself that you have been taught to hide, speaking truths that others prefer not to hear, creating beauty from materials that society considers ugly or inappropriate. The artist of authentic expression learns to trust the creative process even when it leads into unknown territory. You discover that your best work often emerges from your willingness to follow impulses that make no logical sense, to explore themes that seem to have nothing to do with your conscious intentions, to allow your creations to teach you what they want to become, rather than forcing them to conform to your preconceived ideas. This trust requires a fundamental shift in your relationship with failure and success. When creation serves authentic expression rather than external approval, the very definitions of these terms change. Success becomes the depth of your engagement with the creative process, the degree to which you have allowed something genuine to move through you. Failure becomes the extent to which you have compromised your authentic vision in service to external demands. You begin to recognize that your most powerful expressions often emerge from your willingness to be vulnerable, to reveal the parts of yourself that feel most raw, most uncertain, most human. The polished persona that once seemed so important to maintain becomes an obstacle to the kind of expression that actually matters. You learn to create from your wounds, your confusion, your deepest questions, rather than from your need to appear wise, healed, or certain. This vulnerability in creation connects you to the archetypal realm in profound ways. When you express authentically, you often tap into patterns and themes that are universal, that speak to experiences and truths that transcend your personal story. Your individual expression becomes a doorway through which others can access their own depths, their own creativity, their own authentic truth. The transformation from ego-driven to soul-driven expression also changes your relationship with your audience. You stop trying to create for everyone and start creating for those who are ready to receive what you have to offer. You develop an intuitive sense of your true creative community, those souls who resonate with your particular frequency, who are nourished by your specific form of expression. This selectivity is not about exclusion, but about recognition. You understand that authentic expression naturally finds its proper recipients, that trying to make your work accessible to everyone often dilutes it to the point where it serves no one deeply. You learn to trust that your authentic expressions will find their way to the people who need them, often in ways and through channels you could never have planned or predicted. Your creative practice becomes a form of psychological work, a way of engaging with your unconscious, a method for discovering aspects of yourself that cannot be accessed through analysis or reflection alone. Like Jung's Red Book, your authentic expressions become records of your dialogue with the deeper layers of the psyche, documents of your ongoing relationship with the forces that shape your destiny from within. This process often involves creating things that you yourself do not fully understand. You learn to trust expressions that emerge with their own logic, their own necessity, their own reasons for existing. You become comfortable with the mystery of your own creativity, recognizing that the most profound expressions often carry meanings that reveal themselves only over time, through the responses they evoke in others, or through your own evolving understanding. The artist of authentic expression also learns to work with creative cycles, recognizing that periods of intense productivity naturally alternate with times of apparent barrenness. You stop judging these fallow periods as creative failures and start recognizing them as necessary phases of gestation, times when new expressions are forming in the darkness of the unconscious, preparing to emerge when the time is right. Your creative practice becomes continued creative engagement. You create because you must, because something in you demands expression, because the alternative, the suppression of your authentic creative impulses, feels like a kind of death. This sustainability also comes from recognizing that authentic expression is not limited to traditionally artistic mediums. You discover that your entire life can become a form of creative expression, that your relationships, your work, your daily choices can all serve as canvases for the authentic self. The way you speak, the way you move through space, the way you respond to challenges, all of these become opportunities for authentic expression. You develop what might be called a creative relationship with existence itself. Rather than simply responding to life's circumstances, you begin to participate in creating them, to recognize your role as a co-creator in the ongoing emergence of reality. Your authentic expressions ripple outward, influencing not just those who directly encounter your work, but the entire field of collective consciousness. This co-creative relationship with life often involves learning to work with synchronicity, those meaningful coincidences that Jung recognized as signs of the psyche's connection to larger patterns of meaning. Your authentic expressions often attract exactly the people, opportunities, and resources they need to fulfill their purpose in the world. You learn to trust these synchronistic supports while maintaining the integrity of your creative vision. The artist of authentic expression ultimately becomes a servant of the self, that archetypal center of the psyche that Jung saw as the organizing principle of individuation. Your creativity becomes a vehicle for the self's ongoing project of bringing consciousness into the world, of creating new forms through which the eternal can express itself in time, of participating in the great work of cultural and spiritual evolution. This service requires humility because you recognize that your most powerful expressions often feel like they are coming through you rather than from you. You become a channel, a translator, an instrument for forces that are far larger and wiser than your personal consciousness. Your role is not to originate, but to receive, not to control, but to collaborate, not to impose your will, but to align with the creative intelligence that moves through all authentic expression. In becoming an artist of authentic expression, you fulfill one of the deepest purposes of the individuated life, to serve as a unique aperture through which the universal can manifest in particular forms. Your authentic expressions become gifts to the world, offerings of your irreplaceable perspective, contributions to the great ongoing conversation between consciousness and the creative forces that seek to express themselves through human activity. Whether through traditional artistic mediums or through the art of living itself, you have learned to trust the creative impulses that arise from your depths, to follow them with courage and integrity, to allow them to transform not just your own life, but the lives of all those who encounter the fruits of your authentic expression. You have become what the world desperately needs, a human being willing to express truth rather than mere acceptability, beauty rather than mere prettiness, depth rather than mere cleverness. This is your gift and your responsibility to continue, creating from the place of authentic truth, to serve as a conduit for the creative forces that seek expression in this world, to demonstrate through your example that it is possible to live and create from the depths of one's being rather than from the surface of social expectations. In doing so, you participate in the great work of bringing more consciousness, more beauty, more truth into a world that hungers for authentic expression in all its forms. In the deepest chambers of your becoming, you have discovered something that sets you profoundly apart from the frenzied pace of the modern world, an attunement to the sacred timing of psychological processes, a recognition that the psyche operates according to rhythms as ancient and reliable as the turning of seasons, the phases of the moon, the slow spiral of galaxies through space. This is the ninth sign of your transformation. You have learned to trust the organic unfolding the urgency of life and the patience of eternity. You understand that consciousness cannot be hurried, that wisdom cannot be forced, that the deeper transformations of the human spirit unfold according to laws that transcend the mechanical measurements of clocks and calendars. This understanding often arose from your own painful collisions with the impatient demands of ego consciousness. Perhaps you spent years pushing against the natural rhythms of your development, trying to force insights that weren't ready to emerge, attempting to rush through stages of growth that required extended gestation in the darkness of the unconscious. You may have exhausted yourself trying to meet external expectations for personal development, following programs and methodologies that promised transformation on schedule, as if the psyche were a machine that could be optimized for peak performance. But then came the great surrender, the moment when you recognized that your soul was operating according to its own internal clock, responding to forces and influences that your conscious mind could neither understand nor control. You began to notice that your most profound realizations often came not when you were actively seeking them, but during periods of apparent stillness, confusion, or even regression. The breakthrough you had been desperately pursuing for months would suddenly crystallize during a quiet moment when you had given up trying altogether. You discovered that the psyche has seasons just as the natural world does. There are times of budding and blooming, when new insights emerge with startling clarity and creative energy flows through you like spring water after winter's long freeze. There are summers of full manifestation, when the work you have been doing internally begins to bear visible fruit in your outer life, when the seeds planted in earlier seasons finally mature into harvest. But you also learned to honor the autumn times, those periods when the structures you had built begin to crumble, when relationships end, when careers dissolve, when the very foundations of your identity seem to be composting themselves back into the rich soil of possibility. These times of apparent loss and disintegration, you came to understand, are not failures, but necessary phases in the soul's eternal cycle of death and rebirth. Most challenging of all, you learned to trust the winter seasons of the psyche, those dark nights of the soul when nothing seems to be happening, when you feel disconnected from your purpose, when the very meaning that once sustained you seems to have withdrawn into some unreachable place. During these fallow periods, the ego screams with impatience, demanding to know when the darkness will end, when progress will resume, when you will finally get your life back on track. But you have discovered that these winter seasons are perhaps the most sacred time of all. In the apparent emptiness, profound reorganization is taking place in the depths of the unconscious. Like seeds lying dormant beneath frozen ground, new possibilities are gestating in conditions that your conscious mind cannot perceive. The very stillness that feels like death is actually the prelude to a rebirth that could never be achieved through effort or force. Your attunement to sacred timing has taught you to recognize the difference between productive waiting and passive resignation. When you honor the psyche's natural rhythms, your waiting becomes active, alert, pregnant with possibility. You learn to prepare for the spring that you know will come, even when winter seems endless. You tend the inner soil. You maintain your practices. You keep yourself open to the subtle stirrings that signal the beginning of a new cycle. This trust in divine timing often sets you dramatically apart from a culture obsessed with instant gratification, immediate results, and constant progress. While others exhaust themselves trying to force outcomes on artificial schedules, you have learned to work with the deeper currents of becoming. You plant seeds and then wait for them to sprout in their own time. You begin projects without knowing when they will be completed. You enter relationships without demanding immediate clarity about their ultimate destination. Your relationship with goals and achievements has been completely transformed by this understanding. You still set intentions and work toward objectives, recognizing that the path to their fulfillment may be nothing like what your conscious mind envisions. You have learned to distinguish between the ego's impatient desires and the soul's deeper purposes, trusting that the latter will unfold according to a wisdom that transcends your limited perspective. This doesn't mean you become passive or fatalistic. Instead, you develop what might be called active receptivity, a way of engaging with life that combines purposeful action with profound trust in processes beyond your control. You learn to recognize when it's time to push forward, and when it's time to yield, when it's time to plant, and when it's time to harvest, when it's time to speak, and when it's time to remain silent. Your attunement to sacred timing also transforms your understanding of setbacks and failures. What once seemed like evidence that you were on the wrong path now reveals itself as part of the spiral journey of individuation. You recognize that psychological development doesn't follow a straight line, but moves in cycles, circles, and spirals, often requiring you to revisit old patterns and wounds from new levels of awareness. The apparent regression that sometimes accompanies deep inner work no longer terrifies you. You understand that the psyche sometimes needs to deconstruct old structures completely before it can build new ones. That sometimes you must become completely lost before a new sense of direction can emerge from the depths of your being. What looks like going backward is often the soul's way of gathering momentum for a leap forward that couldn't happen any other way. This understanding has profound implications for how you relate to others who are struggling with their own timing. You no longer try to rush friends or family members through their own developmental processes. You stop offering advice designed to speed up their growth and instead learn to offer the rarer gift of patient presence. You become someone who can sit with others in their confusion, their darkness, their not knowing, without needing to fix or solve or hurry them toward resolution. Your trust in sacred timing also affects how you engage with the collective process of cultural and spiritual evolution. You recognize that the changes you long to see in the world, greater consciousness, more compassion, deeper wisdom, are also subject to their own mysterious timing. You work toward these goals while understanding that their manifestation may require generations, that your individual contribution is part of a vast tapestry being woven across time by countless hands. This perspective often brings both relief and responsibility. Relief, because you no longer carry the impossible burden of trying to heal the world single-handedly or within your own lifetime. Responsibility, because you recognize that your individual development and choices contribute to processes much larger than your personal story. You become a conscious participant in evolutionary currents that extend far beyond your individual existence. The sacred timing of the psyche also reveals itself in your creative work and spiritual practice. You learn to trust the creative impulses that emerge from the depths of the unconscious, even when they don't align with your conscious agenda. You allow projects to gestate for as long as they need. You let inspiration come and go without grasping at it. You develop faith in the creative intelligence that operates through you according to its own schedule. In your spiritual development, you stop trying to force enlightenment experiences or mystical insights. You create conditions that support such experiences through meditation, prayer, contemplation, or whatever practices call to you. But you release attachment to when or how such experiences might occur. You learn that the most profound spiritual openings often come disguised as ordinary moments, arriving not when you're seeking them, but when you're simply present to what is. Your attunement to sacred timing ultimately teaches you about the nature of trust itself. Not the naive trust that everything will work out exactly as you hope, but the mature trust that whatever unfolds will serve your deeper development in ways you may never fully understand. This trust doesn't eliminate anxiety or uncertainty, but it provides a container within which these difficult wisdom cannot be learned from books or teachers, but emerges from your willingness to enter into intimate relationship with the rhythms of your own becoming. Living in attunement to sacred timing requires tremendous courage because it often means swimming against the current of cultural expectations. It means disappointing people who want you to change faster, achieve more quickly, resolve your issues according to their timeline. It means trusting processes that cannot be explained or justified to those who operate exclusively within linear time. But this courage is rewarded with a profound sense of alignment with the deeper currents of existence. When you honor the sacred timing of psychological processes, you find yourself supported by forces far greater than your individual will. Opportunities arise with perfect synchronicity. Resources appear exactly when they're needed. People enter your life precisely when you're ready to receive what they have to offer. This is not magic, but the natural result of aligning yourself with the organic intelligence that orchestrates all of life. When you stop fighting against the natural rhythms of development, you discover that these rhythms carry you forward with greater ease and efficiency than any amount of forcing or striving could achieve. The ninth fiery crucible of integration, where opposites meet and create something magnificent, like the fusion of hydrogen and oxygen that births the life-giving waters, or the marriage of darkness and light that paints the sky at dawn. You have become what the alchemists called the hermaphrodite, not the literal merging of masculine and feminine bodies, but the psychological integration of those archetypal principles within your own being. You carry both the solar consciousness that discriminates and acts, and the lunar wisdom that receives and nurtures. You embody both the sword that cuts through illusion and the cup that holds compassion for all that is revealed. This integration manifests first in your relationship with yourself. The harsh inner critic that once tormented you has transformed into the wise inner mentor. The rebellious shadow that once sabotaged your efforts has become the creative force that brings authentic wildness to your carefully constructed life. The wounded child that once demanded attention through dysfunction now offers the gift of wonder and spontaneous joy. You no longer need to choose between being strong or being tender. You have discovered that true strength often requires the courage to be vulnerable, and genuine tenderness sometimes demands the fierce protection of boundaries. You no longer split your world into good and evil, sacred and profane, acceptable and unacceptable. You have learned to find the sacred within the profane, the teaching within the challenge, the gift within the wound. This psychological integration creates a profound shift in your presence. Others feel it immediately, though they may not be able to name what they sense. There is something complete about you now, something settled and whole that invites others to drop their own masks and defenses. Your very being has become a sanctuary where others can safely encounter their own contradictions without fear of judgment or rejection. You have become what Jung described as a bridge between the conscious and unconscious realms. In your presence, people find permission to acknowledge their own shadow aspects without shame, to explore their dreams and intuitions without embarrassment, to express their authentic feelings without fear of being too much or not enough. You catalyze healing not through what you say or do, but through what you are, a living demonstration that wholeness is possible. This is the paradox of the integrated being. The more complete you become within yourself, the more available you are to others. The more you embrace your own darkness, the more light you can hold for those who are still afraid of their shadows. The more you accept your own brokenness, the more you can hold space for others to heal without needing them to be other than they are. Your relationships transform accordingly. No longer do you seek completion through another person, nor do you project your disowned qualities onto partners, friends, or colleagues. Instead, you relate from wholeness to wholeness, allowing others to be fully themselves while maintaining clear boundaries around your own authentic expression. In intimate relationships, this integration creates the possibility for true union, not the merger of two half-people desperately trying to become whole through each other, but the conscious choice of two complete beings to share their wholeness in service of something greater than either could achieve alone. You love without losing yourself, commit without abandoning your autonomy, support without enabling, challenge without attacking. The transcendent function operates not only within the realm of personal relationships, but extends into your engagement with the collective. You have become a bridge between opposing forces in the wider world, not through false harmony or spiritual bypassing, but through your capacity to hold paradox without needing to resolve it immediately. You can acknowledge the validity of different perspectives without losing your own center, can feel deep compassion for all parties in a conflict without becoming overwhelmed by the complexity. This is the gift you offer to a world torn apart by polarization, the lived demonstration that it is possible to hold multiple truths simultaneously, to find the sacred third way that transcends the limitations of binary thinking. Your presence becomes a healing force in for nuance and complexity in a culture that increasingly demands simplification and taking sides. The integration of opposites reveals itself most powerfully in your relationship, with what Jung called the transcendent function, that mysterious capacity of the psyche to generate solutions that honor seemingly irreconcilable conflicts. This is not the mechanical application of problem-solving techniques, but the art of creative synthesis that emerges when you learn to hold tension without premature resolution. You have discovered that the most profound solutions often arise not from choosing between alternatives, but from finding the hidden unity that underlies apparent contradiction. Like the ancient symbol of the Ouroboros, the serpent eating its own tail, you have learned to embrace the cyclical nature of existence, recognizing that every ending contains a beginning, every death a rebirth, every loss a hidden gift. This wisdom transforms your approach to life's inevitable challenges. Where once you might have sought to eliminate problems, you now look for the growth they offer. Where once you might have resisted change, you now dance with it as a partner in the eternal waltz of becoming. Where once you might have feared your own complexity, you now celebrate it as evidence of your growing capacity to contain multitudes. The integration of opposites is perhaps most clearly visible in your relationship with what Jung called enantiodromia, the principle that everything eventually turns into its opposite. You have learned to recognize this cosmic law not as a source of chaos to be feared, but as a natural rhythm to be honored. When you experience great joy, you do not cling to it desperately, but appreciate it fully, while remaining open to the inevitable descent into difficulty. When you face profound challenge, you do not despair, but trust in the hidden seeds of renewal that every ending contains. This understanding frees you from the exhausting attempt to maintain permanent states of happiness, success, or security. Instead, you flow with the natural oscillations of existence, finding stability not in static conditions, but in your capacity to remain centered through all changes. You have become like the mountain that remains unmoved by storms, not because it is rigid, but because it is so deeply rooted that it can bend without breaking. Your creative expression reflects this integration powerfully. No longer do you need to choose between being an artist or a practical person, a visionary or a realist, a spiritual seeker or an engaged citizen. Your creativity emerges from the marriage of all these aspects, producing work that is both beautiful and useful, both inspired and grounded, both personally meaningful and collectively relevant. You create not from the narrow confines of a single identity, but from the vast resource of your integrated being. Your art, your relationships, your work, your very presence becomes a form of active imagination, Jung's term for the conscious participation in the creative processes of the unconscious. You have learned to midwife the birth of new possibilities from the union of seemingly contradictory elements. This integration extends into your relationship with time itself. You no longer live exclusively in the linear time of clocks and calendars, nor do you escape into the timeless realm of transcendence. Instead, you inhabit what the Greeks called kairos, the qualitative dimension of time where past, present, and future converge in moments of profound significance. You have learned to recognize the eternal patterns that repeat throughout your life, seeing how your current challenges echo themes from your past, while simultaneously preparing you for future growth. This cyclical understanding allows you to bring wisdom from previous experiences to present circumstances without being trapped by old patterns, and to plant seeds for future flowering without losing yourself in fantasies of what might be. The integration of opposites manifests in your relationship with power as well. You have learned to distinguish between power over and power with, between domination and influence, appropriate without becoming passive. You lead when called upon without needing to control outcomes. This mature relationship with power allows you to navigate hierarchical structures with grace, honoring appropriate authority while maintaining your own autonomy, challenging injustice without becoming reactive, supporting others without enabling dependence. You have become what Jung called a cultural creative, someone who can work within existing systems while simultaneously transforming them through the power of integrated consciousness. Perhaps most significantly, the integration of opposites has transformed your relationship with what Jung called the self, that archetypal image of wholeness that serves as the organizing principle of the psyche. You have learned to distinguish between the self and the ego, recognizing that your true identity transcends the narrow confines of personality while still honoring the ego as a necessary vehicle for navigating the world of form. This distinction allows you to serve something greater than your personal desires without losing your individual uniqueness. You have become a conscious participant in what Jung called the individuation process, not the development of a more refined ego, but the gradual realization of the self through the integration of all aspects of your being. You embody the paradox of being fully yourself while simultaneously belonging to something infinitely larger than yourself. You are like a wave that knows itself to be part of the ocean, maintaining its unique form and movement while never forgetting its essential unity with the whole. This recognition brings profound peace, for you no longer need to choose between personal fulfillment and service to others, between self-care and selflessness, between individual expression and collective responsibility. The integration of opposites has made you a living bridge between worlds, the personal and transpersonal, the individual and collective, the temporal and eternal. Your very existence becomes a healing force in a world torn apart by false dichotomies and destructive polarizations. Through your embodied demonstration of wholeness, you offer others a glimpse of what is possible when consciousness learns to embrace paradox rather than eliminate it. This is the profound gift of integration, not the elimination of tension, but the transformation of conflict into creative collaboration. You have become a vessel for the transcendent function, a space where opposites can meet and dance and birth new possibilities for healing and growth. In your integrated presence, others find permission to embrace their own contradictions, to explore their own complexity, to discover their own unique way of being whole. You are the living proof that the human psyche is not doomed to eternal conflict between its various aspects, but capable of extraordinary synthesis and creative resolution. Through your example, you demonstrate that consciousness can learn to hold multiple truths simultaneously, that the heart can expand to embrace all aspects of experience, that the soul can find its way home to wholeness despite the apparent fragmentation of modern life. This is your gift to the world, not perfection, but integration. Not the elimination of shadow, but the conscious relationship with darkness. Not the transcendence of human nature, but the full embrace of what it means to be magnificently, paradoxically, completely human. There is a frequency that emanates from those who have found their way home to themselves, a subtle vibration that speaks without words, teaches without instruction, and transforms without force. You have become a tuning fork for this sacred resonance, this frequency of individuation that Jung recognized as the deepest calling of the human soul. This is not the frequency of perfection, for perfection belongs to the realm of mechanical precision, and you have learned that the soul's journey is far more organic, far more alive than any machine could ever be. This is the frequency of authenticity, raw, unfiltered, sometimes beautiful, sometimes difficult, but always real. It is the something you possess, but something you serve. Not something you achieve, but something you become. It is the deepest pattern of your individuality, the unique way that universal consciousness expresses itself through the particular vessel of your life. This frequency of individuation cannot be faked or manufactured. It emerges only from the deep work of psychological development, from the courage to face your own darkness, from the willingness to question everything you thought you knew about yourself and the world. It is the reward for those who have dared to descend into their own underworld and return with treasures that cannot be bought or sold, only lived and embodied. Listen closely, and you will hear it in the way you speak. Not the words themselves, but the quality of presence behind them. There is a groundedness there, a rootedness that comes from having found your own center of gravity. You no longer need to borrow authority from external sources, no longer need to quote others to validate your own insights. You have discovered the inner authority that comes from deep self-knowledge, from the hard-won wisdom of your own experience. This inner authority is not the brittle arrogance of the inflated ego, but the quiet confidence of someone who has made peace with their own limitations and learned to work creatively within them. You know what you know, and you know what you don't know, and you have learned to be comfortable in both states. This humility, paradoxically, gives you tremendous power, the power to influence without manipulating, to lead without dominating, to teach without preaching. Your life has become what Jung called a unique expression of archetypal patterns, a singular variation on the universal themes that have echoed through human consciousness since the beginning of time. You are the hero of your own journey, but you understand that this heroism is not about conquering external enemies or achieving worldly success. It is about the far more subtle and profound task of becoming who you truly are. Beneath all the layers of conditioning and expectation, you carry within you the archetype of the wise old man or woman, not because you have lived a certain number of years, but because you have learned to listen to the voice of wisdom that speaks from the depths of your own being. You embody the archetype of the magician, not because you can perform supernatural feats, but because you have learned to transform lead into gold within the laboratory of your own consciousness. This archetypal quality of your being manifests in countless subtle ways. People find themselves telling you things they have never told anyone, not because you ask probing questions, but because your presence creates a safe space for truth to emerge. Children and animals are drawn to you instinctively, sensing the authentic humanity that radiates from your being. Strangers find themselves opening up in your presence as if your own authenticity gives them permission to drop their masks and reveal their true faces. The frequency of individuation carries with it a profound understanding of what Jung meant when he spoke of spiritual maturity. You have learned that true spiritual development is not about transcending the human condition, but about fully embodying it with consciousness. You do not seek to escape the challenges of earthly existence, but to meet them with ever deeper levels of awareness and compassion. This understanding sets you apart from those who mistake spiritual bypassing for spiritual development, who use meditation and philosophy as ways to avoid the messy complexity of human relationships and emotions. You have learned that the divine is not found by escaping the human, but by diving so deeply into your humanity that you discover the sacred at its core. Your spiritual practice, whatever form it takes, is no longer about achieving special states or accumulating mystical experiences. It has become a way of staying connected to the source of your being, a daily remembering of who you are beneath all the roles and responsibilities that fill your days. You pray not to get something from the divine, but to give something back, to offer your unique gifts in service of the greater whole. This frequency of individuation sometimes disturbs those who are still caught in what Jung called collective identification, the unconscious adoption of mass attitudes identity around conformity, who find security in blending into the crowd and thinking the thoughts that everyone else thinks. You have learned not to take this disturbance personally, understanding that it is often a sign that you are touching something true, something that threatens the false security of collective unconsciousness. Like Socrates, whose questions disturbed the comfortable assumptions of his contemporaries, your authenticity can be a mirror that reflects back to others their own unlived lives, their own unfulfilled potential. Yet this same frequency that sometimes disturbs also deeply attracts those who are ready for their own journey of individuation. You become a beacon for others who are beginning to question the collective assumptions, who are starting to feel the stirring of their own authentic self beneath the layers of social conditioning. Your example gives them courage to begin their own descent into the depths, their own exploration of what it means to be truly themselves. This is the paradox of the individuated being. The more uniquely yourself you become, the more universally accessible you are to others. The more you embody your own particular truth, the more you touch the universal truths that resonate in every human heart. Your specificity becomes a gateway to the archetypal. Your personal journey becomes a map that others can follow while still finding their own way. The frequency of individuation manifests in your relationship with time and eternity. You have learned to live simultaneously in the temporal world of clocks and calendars and the eternal realm of mythic time. Your daily activities are infused with a sense of sacred purpose, not because you have achieved some special status, but because you have learned to recognize the eternal patterns that play out through the most ordinary moments. You understand that your life is both utterly unique and completely archetypal, both deeply personal and universally significant. This understanding allows you to take your own journey seriously without taking yourself too seriously, to recognize the importance of your individual development while remaining humble before the mystery of existence. This frequency carries with it a deep acceptance of paradox and contradiction. You have learned to hold opposing truths simultaneously without needing to resolve them into some artificial harmony. You can be both strong and vulnerable, both independent and interdependent, both deeply rooted in your own truth and completely open to learning from others. This comfort with paradox extends to your understanding of your own nature. You know yourself to be both limited and unlimited, both human and divine, both individual and part of something infinitely larger than yourself. This paradoxical self-knowledge gives you a profound sense of both humility and dignity, both groundedness and transcendence. The frequency of individuation reveals itself in your creative expression. Whatever form your creativity takes, whether in art, relationships, work, or simply in the way you live your daily life, it carries the unmistakable signature of your authentic being. You create not to impress others or to achieve external recognition, but because creativity is the natural expression of a life that has found its own center. Your creative work becomes a form of what Jung called active imagination, a conscious participation in the creative processes of the unconscious. You learn to trust the images and insights that arise from the depths of your being, to give them form and expression without needing to understand them intellectually. Your creativity becomes a bridge between the personal participates in the eternal patterns that give meaning to all existence. This recognition brings a profound peace, a sense of already being home in the deepest sense. The frequency of individuation manifests in your relationship with suffering and joy. You have learned that both are necessary threads in the tapestry of a complete life, that attempting to have one without the other leads to a kind of spiritual and emotional poverty. You welcome joy when it comes without grasping after it, and you meet suffering when it arrives without running away from it. This mature relationship with the full spectrum of human experience allows you to be present with others in their darkest moments without being overwhelmed by their pain, and to celebrate with them in their brightest moments without being diminished by envy. You have become what Jung called a wounded healer, someone who has learned to transform their own suffering into wisdom and compassion that can serve others. Your presence carries the frequency of what Jung called the transcendent function, that mysterious capacity of the psyche to find creative solutions to seemingly impossible problems. You have learned to trust the wisdom that emerges from the depths of your being, to allow solutions to arise organically rather than forcing them through willpower or intellectual analysis. This trust in the transcendent function extends to your relationship with the unknown and uncertain. You have learned to live comfortably with not knowing, to embrace the mystery that surrounds and permeates all existence. This comfort with uncertainty allows you to remain open to new possibilities, to continue growing and evolving even as you age and accumulate experience. The frequency of individuation reveals itself in your relationship with power and influence. You have learned to distinguish between authentic power, the power that comes from being aligned with your deepest truth, and the various forms of false power that the ego seeks to accumulate. Your influence flows naturally from your authenticity, attracting those who resonate with your frequency while repelling those who are not ready for the truth you embody. You wield this influence with great care, understanding that with authentic power comes great responsibility. You use your gifts not to manipulate or control others, but to create space for them to discover their own authentic power. You lead by example rather than by force. Teach through your being rather than through your words. Heal through your presence rather than through your techniques. This frequency of individuation that you carry is not a personal achievement, but a gift to the collective. Every person who completes their journey of individuation adds to the store of consciousness available to the human race. Your authenticity becomes a beacon that lights the way for others. Your courage becomes a source of strength for those who are still finding their way. You understand that your individual development is not separate from the development of the collective, but intimately connected to it. The more fully you become yourself, the more you contribute to the evolution of human consciousness. Your personal journey of individuation becomes a gift to future generations, a small but significant contribution to the great work of helping humanity grow toward greater awareness and compassion. The frequency of individuation that you now embody is both the culmination of your journey and the beginning of a new phase of development. You have learned to live from your own center, to trust your own deepest wisdom, to express your unique gifts without apology or hesitation. This is the fundamental achievement of the individuated being, not perfection, but authenticity, not the elimination of problems, but the creative transformation of challenges into opportunities for growth and service. You resonate now with the eternal patterns that give meaning to all existence, while remaining grounded in the particular circumstances of your own life. You have become a unique expression of universal consciousness, a singular note in the cosmic symphony that has never been played before and will never be played again. This is your gift to the world, the irreplaceable contribution of your authentic being to the ongoing creation of reality itself. into your presence whether they are conscious of it or not. Some will be drawn to this light like moths to illumination, sensing in you something they long for but cannot name. Others will retreat from it instinctively, feeling exposed or uncomfortable in ways they cannot articulate. This is the paradox of your return. The very authenticity that could heal the world often threatens those who are still hiding from themselves. You must learn to navigate this delicate territory with the wisdom of the serpent and the innocence of the dove. Your frequency is not a weapon to be wielded against the unconscious, nor a badge of superiority to be displayed for validation. It is a gift to be offered gently, without expectation, like seeds scattered on the wind with no attachment to where they might take root. The world you return to has not changed, you have. The same dramas play out in offices and families, the same patterns of projection and reaction cycle through communities and nations. But now you see these patterns with different eyes, feel them with a different heart. Where once you might have been triggered into reactivity, you now experience a deeper kind of response, one that arises from your center rather than your wounds. This does not mean you have become immune to pain or unaffected by suffering. Rather, you have learned to hold pain without being defined by it, to feel suffering without being overwhelmed by it. You have discovered that compassion is not the absence of boundaries, but the presence of conscious choice about how and when to engage with the suffering of others. Your relationships transform in ways both subtle and profound. With family members who knew you before your transformation, you must navigate the delicate dynamics of change within unchanging systems. They may resist your evolution, sensing that your growth somehow challenges their own stagnation. You learn to love them without needing them to understand you, to honor their journey without abandoning your own path. In intimate partnerships, you discover that you can no longer participate in the unconscious dance of projection and counter-projection that characterizes so many relationships. You love from wholeness rather than neediness, choose from freedom rather than fear, commit from strength rather than weakness. This can be profoundly unsettling to partners who are accustomed to the familiar patterns of codependence and drama. You must learn to be patient with this process, remembering that not everyone is ready for the level of consciousness you now embody. Your task is not to drag others into awareness, but to live so authentically that you create space for their own awakening if and when they are ready. You become like a tuning fork, offering a stable frequency that others can attune to if they choose. In your work and professional life, you face the challenge of maintaining your authenticity within systems that often reward conformity and punish individual expression. You must learn to navigate corporate hierarchies and institutional structures without losing your soul, to play the necessary games without becoming identified with the roles you must play. This requires a kind of spiritual aikido, the ability to work with the energy of systems rather than against them, to find ways to introduce consciousness into unconscious structures without triggering defensive reactions. You become skilled at speaking the language of whatever environment you find yourself in while never forgetting your own native tongue. The frequency you carry often attracts those who are ready for their own transformation. People find themselves drawn to you without understanding why, sensing in your presence something they desperately need but cannot name. You become an inadvertent teacher, a reluctant guru, a catalyst for change in ways you never intended or sought. This attraction brings its own challenges. Some will try to make you into their savior, projecting onto you their own unlived potential and expecting you to solve problems that only they can solve. Others will test your authenticity, consciously or unconsciously, probing for the places where you might be pretending or performing rather than simply being. You learn to receive both the projections and the tests with equanimity, neither inflating with praise nor deflating speak and when to remain silent, when to act and when to wait, when to engage and when to withdraw. You develop what might be called spiritual intelligence, the ability to read the subtle energies of situations and respond from wisdom rather than habit. This intelligence manifests in countless small moments throughout your day. The pause before responding to a challenging email, the breath you take before entering a tense meeting, the moment of checking in with yourself before making any significant decision. These micro-practices become the foundation for living from your authentic center rather than from your conditioned patterns. You discover that maintaining your frequency in the world is not about finding perfect conditions or surrounding yourself only with conscious people. It's about learning to remain true to yourself regardless of external circumstances, to source your sense of identity and worth from within rather than from the responses of others. This inner sourcing becomes particularly important when you encounter the inevitable misunderstandings and projections that come with living authentically. You will be misunderstood by those who interpret your authenticity through the lens of their own fears and limitations. You will be criticized by those who feel threatened by your refusal to participate in collective unconsciousness. Learning to remain centered in the face of such reactions is perhaps the greatest skill of the returning hero. You must develop what the Zen tradition calls great doubt, coupled with great faith. Doubt in your own righteousness and certainty, faith in the deeper process that is unfolding through your life and the lives of all beings. The frequency you embody becomes a bridge between worlds, the world of unconscious reactivity and the world of conscious response, the world of separation and the world of connection, the world of fear and the world of love. You learn to speak multiple languages fluently, the language of the ego when necessary, the language of the heart when appropriate, the language of the soul when called for. This multilingual capacity allows you to meet people where they are rather than demanding that they rise to meet you where you are. You can speak of practical matters with those who live in the practical world, of emotional truths with those who inhabit the realm of feeling, of spiritual realities with those who are ready for such conversations. Yet, beneath all these languages, your authentic frequency remains constant, like a steady bass note that provides harmony and grounding for whatever melody is being played in the moment. People feel this consistency in you, this reliability that comes not from rigid adherence to rules, but from flexible alignment with truth. The challenge of living your frequency authentically requires you to embrace what Jung called the tension of opposites. You must be simultaneously rooted and flexible, confident and humble, strong and tender, individual and connected. This is not the static balance of a scale, but the dynamic balance of a dancer, constantly adjusting, constantly responding, constantly finding equilibrium in movement. You learn that authenticity is not a fixed state, but a continuous process of attunement. Each moment presents new opportunities to align more deeply with your truth, to choose response over reaction, to offer presence over performance. The frequency is not something you achieve once and then maintain automatically. It is something you must consciously choose again and again. This conscious choosing becomes easier with practice, but it never becomes effortless. There is always the gravitational pull of old patterns, the temptation to slip back into familiar forms of unconsciousness, the seduction of blending into the collective rather than standing in your individual truth. Vigilance is required, but it is the gentle vigilance of a gardener tending delicate seedlings, not the harsh vigilance of a soldier guarding against enemies. Your presence affects the world around you. This requires a deep trust in the process itself, a faith that consciousness shared is consciousness multiplied, that every individual who commits to their own authenticity contributes to the authenticity of the whole. The return is not about changing the world through force or manipulation. It is about changing the world through transformation, your own. Continuous transformation, and the invitation your example extends to others to undertake their own. You become living proof that another way is possible, that human beings can evolve beyond their conditioning, that consciousness can triumph over unconsciousness without violence or coercion. Living this frequency authentically requires tremendous courage, not the courage of the warrior who faces external enemies, but the courage of the mystic who faces the truth of their own being moment by moment. It takes courage to remain open when others are closing down, to stay soft when others are hardening, to choose love when others are choosing fear. This courage is not heroic in the conventional sense. It is quiet, steady, unglamorous. It is the courage to have difficult conversations with family members, to maintain your boundaries with needy friends, to speak truth to power when necessary, to admit your mistakes and limitations, to continue growing even when growth is uncomfortable. You discover that the frequency of your authentic being is not separate from the frequency of life itself. As you align more completely with your own truth, you find yourself in greater harmony with the natural rhythms and cycles that govern all existence. You learn to trust these rhythms, to flow with them rather than fight against them. This alignment brings a profound sense of coming home, not to a place, but to a way of being. You realize that you have been searching outside yourself for something that was always within, that the treasure you went so far to find was hidden in your own heart all along. The return is really a recognition. You never left home. You simply forgot where home was. The living of your authentic frequency becomes not a burden to be carried, but a joy to be shared. You discover that being truly yourself is not selfish, but selfless. Not because you sacrifice your individuality for others, but because your individuality, fully expressed, serves something greater than itself. You embody the paradox that Jung pointed toward. The more completely individual you become, the more universally valuable you are. Your unique expression of consciousness adds something irreplaceable to the collective treasury of human experience. Your return to authenticity is not your achievement alone, but a gift to all who will come after you. The circle completes itself, but it is not a closed circle. It is a spiral, each return to authenticity occurring at a deeper level, each integration of consciousness expanding your capacity to serve life more fully. You have learned to live the frequency not as a final destination, but as an endless journey of becoming, an eternal return to the truth of who you have always been, beneath all the layers of who you thought you had to be. This is the completion and the beginning, the end and the commencement, the return that is also a departure into ever greater possibilities for consciousness to know itself through the magnificent, paradoxical, endlessly creative experience of being human. YouTube video description. In this profound exploration of consciousness and authentic being, we journey into the heart of Carl Jung's understanding of individuation, the sacred process of becoming who you truly are beneath all the layers of who you thought you had to be. This isn't merely philosophical theory, it's a lived experience of discovering that your authentic frequency harmonizes perfectly with the deeper rhythms of existence itself. Jung understood that the most complete individual expression, paradoxically, serves the collective whole. As you align with your genuine nature, you discover that authenticity isn't selfish. It's the most selfless gift you can offer the world. Your unique consciousness adds something irreplaceable to the treasury of human experience. video explores the profound recognition that what we seek externally has always resided within us. The journey toward authenticity becomes a spiral of deepening awareness, each return to your true self occurring at ever greater depths. You'll discover how living your authentic frequency transforms from burden to joy, from personal achievement to collective service. The path of individuation is both completion and beginning, an eternal return to the truth of who you've always been, beneath all conditioning and expectation. This is Jung's gift to us, the understanding that becoming fully yourself is not the end of the journey, but its endless, magnificent beginning. What resonates most deeply with your own journey toward authenticity? Share your reflections below. Your insights contribute to our collective understanding of this profound human process. Hashtags: Carl Jung, Individuation, Authentic Self, Jungian Psychology, Consciousness, Evolution, Self-Realization, Depth, Psychology, Personal Transformation, Analytical Psychology, Inner Work, Psychological Development, Self-Actualization, Mindful Awareness, Spiritual Psychology, Human Potential.